Hi, I'm Sharina Hamza Osborne. I'm an Honorary Research Associate in the Faculty of Humanity and Social Science at Swansea University, Wales, United Kingdom. I am the author of this book titled Jeanette Winston's Narrative of Desire, Rethinking Fetishism, which was published by Bloomsbury last month. I am your chair today. So today we are in panel 4C, Analysing Women. So we have three speakers today, Francesca, Lois, Elena Lopez, and Christina Rabu. So just a bit of housekeeping. So after all the three speakers finish, then we have the question. You can ask a question. You can either type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and then we can ask the questions, okay? So our first speaker today, I would just, introduce our first speaker, Francesca Lewis. Francesca is a doctorate candidate in women's studies at University of York. Following her BA in English Literature and Creative Writing, she studied for an MA in Interdisciplinary Psychology at Leeds Beckett University, where her dissertation received the highest grade ever awarded on the program. Her current research builds on that work, exploring counter-diagnostic meaning and queer epistemologies through creative and diffractive methods and methodologies. Her research interests include the self, subject, and autobiography, trauma, madness, and self-definition, diagnosis, phenomenology, and new materialism. Title of her paper today, I am a proponent of aporia, Johanna Heda, and autonosis. The floor is yours. You're ready.
Okay, hello everyone. I shall share my screen and we'll get going. So before I begin, can everyone see the first slide?
Yes.
Okay, and please let me know if it's doing something like not skipping slides or something horrible. Okay. Okay. Aporia, a point of undecidability, where a text of any kind undermines its own rhetorical structure, dismantles or deconstructs itself. I am a proponent of aporia. My address is an affirmation of messiness, a testimony of and to disorder, an honouring of incompleteness, Johanna Hedberg. In tarot, the Fool card is numbered 0. It conjures the mad, the queer, the marginal, everywhere and nowhere, wise because of their ignorance of what everyone knows. I've spent my life on the razor's edge between options that others seem to think of as mutually exclusive. This has typically been understood as a refusal to choose or an unwillingness to claim my ground, when it is more properly known as a refusal of the idea that life can be boiled down to binary distinctions and an affirmation of the groundless, the boundless, the shifting void. My doctoral research, now almost complete, seeks to illuminate borderline experience, known clinically as borderline personality disorder, an experience for many fraught reasons that I find it difficult to claim, and yet it is the place that I speak from and have always spoken from, regardless of any institutions that have placed me there. My research practice is comprised of affective and diffractive engagement with a number of texts, including my own creative writing, the kind that Jean Perrault calls autography, which brings selves into being, signifying both continuity with an ongoing life in a body and a community, and dissociation within that life, gaps, amputations, silences. My work looks beyond the stigmas attached to the borderline diagnosis and their roots in the DSM's pathologization of instability, ambiguity, and fragmentation. Having long suffered under the cruel optimism of hoping for the right diagnosis, hoping for the right treatment, hoping for the much coveted, deeply problematic state of wellness, I and many like me have abandoned hope, choosing instead a radical affirmation of and within borderline experience. Paradoxically, borderline indefinability is central to how it has been defined. The very term borderline was first used to describe patients who did not fit pre-existing categories of neurosis and psychosis. Speaking as someone diagnosed with BPD, I find this reliance on binary definitions troubling and question why many of the things I experience need to be pathologized. Yet I also recognize a kind of difference in my experience that does relate to an undefinable, irreducible betweenity. I wanted to explore my experience of presence and non-presence, self and non-self, existence and non-existence, what are broadly referred to in the clinical sphere as dissociative symptoms, and can be thought of as something between reckless existential feeling and Ahmed's queer orientations, in order to both validate their legitimacy as forms of experience and to show how all selves and experiences are contingent, changeable, and very much not the fixed and stable universal subjects neoliberalism demands. Writer, artist, musician, and astrologer Johanna Hedver, whose 2016 essay Sick Woman Theory articulates the revolutionary potential of illness, and who continues to be an essential voice on disability and madness, is something of a luminary in medical humanities, and has certainly been a kind of North Star for this project, or perhaps a dark star, drawing me ever closer. I think they would prefer that analogy. They speak about their madness as a form of suffering and a valuable and meaningful experience. What makes Hedver's work resonant for me is that what they are doing could be described as, to use a term of my own coinage that this paper will endeavour to briefly describe, autognostic. In their essay, In Defence of Depersons, they write, "The DSM is based entirely upon their rules of what is recognisable. It has nothing to do with what you might recognise or feel validated within or define your own experience." They go on to describe their experience of depersonalisation, derealisation disorder, first giving a clinical description, experiences of unreality or detachment from one's mind, self, or body. Directly following this with their own description of what DPDR feels like. My body, self, environment, and the world itself do not feel real. The essay continues in this vein, the clinical and the experiential placed side by side. Hedver's work beautifully articulates the feeling of always already being immersed in one's experience. I am not representative for a kind of experience. I am presentative of it, they write. That is, I am doing it right now in front of you and in front of myself. When I speak, when I write, I do so from the borderline. I am not here to represent BPD as if we were all identical or as if I'm a distillation of everything that BPD can be. I am, like Hedver, presentative of borderline experience. And this presence, including the presence of absence, materializes in the whole of my work, in the reading, the writing, the thinking. Speaking from within madness is not an easy thing, and being heard is even harder. Hamlet's famous question reveals his privilege, power, and specifically his authority, that he gets to decide whether to be or not, Hedver writes. At its etymological root, authority is about authorship. Hamlet can be the author of himself. Margaret Price, who coined the term counterdiagnosis, is concerned with how rhetoric, epistemology, and what she calls psychosocial disabilities intersect. The purpose of the counterdiagnostic is to reclaim mad experience, but to do so in a way that resists the diagnostic urge to explain the disabled mind. As a kind of testimony, mad speech is often dismissed, what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. Considered incoherent, the question is often, how can we trust what the mad claim to know? Price argues that this very incoherence has meaning and value in and of itself. This is one of those aporia Hedver refers to in their work, the valuable incongruity of some kinds of experience. These aporia have the potential to reveal the illusory nature of the qualities the borderline or the deperson is deemed to lack. For who among us is a coherent self, a singular knowable individual? So if my work is counterdiagnostic, why use another term? Autognosis is not a challenge or opposition to counterdiagnosis, but rather an attempt to build upon or take inspiration from Price's excellent work towards a more specific aim. One of the main recalibrations I wanted to make was to consider what the word diagnosis means in the context of my work. Since dia means between and gnosis means knowledge, diagnosis conjures the betweenity of the doctor-patient relationship. I prefer the prefix auto, meaning self, one's own, or of oneself. If diagnosis is knowledge between doctor and patient, and counterdiagnosis is a refusal of or queering of this, autognosis is borderline knowledge of and from borderline experience. Replacing the letter O with the empty set symbol makes central the fact that self and knowledge, as well as self-knowledge, are always and endlessly shifting spaces with no fixed meaning. In mathematics, the empty set is a variable that is not nothing and not something, an empty box, a void that may or may not contain something, an indeterminate space of possibility. Like the fool, like Schrodinger's cat, autognosis affirms selves, including no self, and knowledges, including no knowledge, beyond the DSM. It is a rejection of a unified self, any kind of fixed truth, and the trap of defining oneself purely to become legible. Autognosis is onto-epistemological, attending to and presentative of the entanglement of knowing and being. It is a queer phenomenology, after Sarah Ahmed, a phenomenology that refuses to be quite proper, and a cropistemology, a term coined by Mary Lisa Johnson and Robert McRuer to describe knowledges of, about, and through queer crip experience. The idea of resonance emerged in the work as a guiding principle. Resonance is embodied, and like vision, dependent on location. One must be close to something to feel its vibrations. Aporia, then, might be moments when resonances are discordant. This paper is a map of those vibrations, harmonious, cacophonous, evocatively jarring. When two or more vibrations meet, we get diffraction, another guiding principle here. Karen Barad draws on the feminist work of Trinh Minh Ha and Donna Haraway and a background in quantum physics to propose the method of diffractive reading. This method focuses on phenomena over identities, reading texts, events, experiences, and ideas through and with each other, thinking with the patterns of difference made by interactions within phenomena. This approach attempts to undermine binary logic, dualisms, and myths of fixity. That was supposed to be for what I've just said. The aporia of sick woman theory, writes Hedver, is that it requires a cruelly optimistic humanism to construct and nurture a version of a human against a version of the human. And it still relies upon the master's tools of enforcing discrete selfhood and self-possession. In Defense of Depersons can be read as an autognostic companion essay to Sick Woman theory, in which Hedva simultaneously constructs and deconstructs knowledge and self-knowledge. The deperson is at once a deconstructing and reconstructing of the sick woman, allowing Hedva to read the one through the other, not as opposites, but as importantly different and equally meaningful modes of self-understanding. In writing a radical affirmation of their experience as a deperson, Hedva attempts to dismantle the universal concept of the person, which promises, as they put it, self-determined completeness, wholeness, and power. My own autognostic work began with borderline subjectivity, attempting to construct the borderline subject against the universal as a radical alternative. This mirror logic, like the sick woman, was a valuable form of counter-diagnosis, but I had not accounted for the void, the spaces, the gaps, the discordance, the aporia. I had attempted to claim the throne of the universal, when what I really wanted to do was tear it down. The direction to go, we are conditioned to believe, writes Hedva, is up, like birds trapped in a room. But it's the throne itself that we must tear down, the throne on which the universal sits. That there is a throne at all is the problem, regardless of who sits in it. We don't need to go up, let's look to the windows, the way out. But how to get out, how to find these windows? For me, the answer is through autognosis and through shifting my way of thinking from selves to spaces, from essentializing to spatializing. The borderline is not an essential type, a list of traits in a big book, but a space some of us speak from, live from, feel from. Exploring borderline experience autognostically has become a process of mapping. Like Deleuze and Guattari, who advocate making maps, not tracings, I have come to understand the huge importance of this change in perspective. For them, knowledge, in particular psychoanalytic knowledge, typically tries to trace what it sees, to make fixed copies, to capture. We see this in the DSM and in pop culture depictions of BPD. Deleuze and Guattari argue for knowledge production as map making, open and connective. Presentation of processes over representation of objects. Autognosis is what happens when the mad speak, when their situated position in the terrain of madness, without seeking to explain from their situated position in the terrain of madness, without seeking to explain or fix gaps, silences, and aporia. As Hedva writes of mysticism, which has much overlap with the kind of madness they and I are interested in. An explanation of mysticism will only ever fail. So a circumscription of that failure, an account of the unknowing, must be the point. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Francisca. And yeah, can you stop sharing that? Okay, thank you. So thank you, that's very, very interesting. I already have a question there, but let's go to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Elena Lopez. Yeah, okay. Elena Lopez is a PhD student from the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Her thesis is based on Latin American literature written by women in the 1980s. She is investigating 3 best-selling authors, Jocanda Belli, Angeles Matreta, and Isabel Allende, whose novels have been translated into several languages and sold around the world. Her titled paper today is Clinical Analysis of the Characters in Gioconda Balli's The Inhabited Woman. All right, so it's all yours.
Hi, I'm going to share my screen. Just a minute. Okay. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay. Well, hi. In this paper, I propose to analyze the protagonist of the book The Inhabited Woman, written by the Nicaraguan author Gioconda Belli and published in 1988. The author presents us as the main character, a woman who fights for her emancipation in an androcentric world, and also the moment when she's aware of the inequalities and discriminations due to the fact of being a woman and how she faces it or even how she uses it. Therefore, the analysis is also offered to see from a gender perspective, understanding this as a broad and complex structure of the self, configured from the beginning in an unconscious intersubjective exchange between the parental figures and their daughter. The protagonist's name is Lavinia. She's 23 years old. She belongs to the Central America high class. She says that both her father and her mother were more concerned with keeping up appearance than raising her daughter. For this reason, she was mainly raised by her paternal aunt, Inés. Thanks to her social class, she's able to study architecture in Europe. And the novel is set when she returns from Europe to Faguas, her hometown, where she lives independently in the house of her aunt Inés, now deceased, and starts working in an architect's office where she meets Felipe. Because of their relationship, she gets involved with the guerrilla and with the liberation movement. For understanding Lavinia, it is really important to understand her historical context. Faguas is an imaginary place located in Latin America, and in this moment is developing a dictatorship, and due to the dictatorship of the great general, poverty and fear coexist in the daily life of the working class. The novel exposes the contrast between the working class, the high class, and the military caste. And the military class makes all kinds of ostentation to show their power, but the high class does not think them worthy to move in their circles. The dictator family is an example of this attempt by the military to equal or even surpass the wealthy class. The protagonist is aware at all the times of how her society places her in a subordinate place with respect to men because of sexism, division of workforce, and so the understanding as a woman as a sexual object. Also, in order to understand Lavinia as a novel, it's really important to understand her childhood, she as a child. As said, her father and mother were more concerned with keeping up appearance than raising her daughter. Lavinia experiences the distance from her parents with sadness, especially the distance from her mother, and she considers that this love cannot be replaced, and therefore, in moments of melancholy, she always resorts to the absence of the parents. However, Lavinia as a child keeps the figure of her mother idealized. Even if she's distant from her parents, she has also two important figures in her childhood: her grandfather, who is a dictatorship dissident, and her aunt Inés, who is also the most important. During the novel, she's developing through four important characters: her aunt Inés, the mother, Felipe, and the guerrilla. The guerrilla is a group, but we can understand it as a character. The first one, Aunt Inés, is the responsible of the primary narcissization of the child. As said, she was mainly raised by her Aunt Inés. She fulfills the function of an attachment figure who provides attention, comfort, protection, She was a provider of admiration and recognition of the child, and she also conveys a powerful image to the girl and fosters a fantasy of exceptionality. Lavinia recognized that she has incorporated her ideals of independence and that her aunt Inez had passed on to her, as well as the idea of a future not determined by social class or gender. She feels narcissized by the thought that she has been able to achieve what her aunt was unable to experience because she belonged to a particular time and place. So Lavinia feels that she's autonomous and she can be independent. The second character is the mother, who is the representation of the traditional femininity for Lavinia. The mother shows a lack of capacity to calm the child. In the search of her attachment figures, the mother devalues the child. This will influence the intimate relationship that Lavinia will establish in the future. Lavinia recognized herself as a lonely child. Throughout the novel, the anguish produced by her relationship with her mother appears as a recurring theme. Lavinia does not seem to have an elaborated explanation for her mother's treatment, nor there is any acceptance of perceived lack of affection. Despite of an apparent self-esteem, there is a perceived narcissistic flaw, a desire to be loved and accepted by the man, to be the object of her mother's desire. The little girl's need for affirmation from her mother makes her find fantasy a place of protection. There are conflicts in her ideal of the self. It involves the rejection of the traditional femininity that she sees represented by her man, and a desire to be independent. On the other hand, she experiences distance of this relationship since differentiation experience and separation of the relationship. When this rejection of femininity is functioned, it generates a source of well-being for her, reinforcing her self-image by fulfilling the mandate of her superego. Lavinia experiences frustration, anger, and desolation when she tries to find recognition as an equal, not as a sexual object in the patriarchal world in which she finds herself. The fourth one is Felipe, who is the romantic interest of Lavinia. Lavinia, at the beginning of the relationship with Felipe, describes her attitude as mocking. She feels that he looks herself in a stereotypical way. She's attracted to Felipe, someone to whom she gives authority and values positively from her ideals: independence, security, wisdom, physical strength. Lavinia seems to experience the relationship with anguish and not reciprocal. She experiences the situation as a failure of her ideal of independence. She feels small and needy. Then a demanding superego is observed. She criticizes herself and blames himself for not being able to fulfill her ideal of independence. And the disagreement with Felipe arises mainly when he imposes his times or obligation with respect to the guerrilla, where he possibly reinforces narcissism. While she feels rejected because of her narcissistic damage, she realized the childhood rejection of her mother, who puts her beauty and social issues before her needs as a child. Faced with this trait of emptiness or lack of care for Felipe, she also tries to calm herself by rationalizing with the message learned from her aunt Inez. The fourth main character here is the guerrilla as a group. The protagonist becomes involved in the guerrilla. At first, she was unaware of the situation and feels fear and a desire to escape because of her self-preservation. In a second moment, she becomes aware of the others. After hearing Felipe's story, Lavinia leaves fear behind for the moment and feels the need to respond to the other's emotional state. to take care of him, even though she knows that she has been put in danger because of a hereditary preservation. The fears that arises from this life-threatening situation leads to experiences of depersonalization. The personalization is caused because two factors. On the one hand, anguish that disorganized the representation of herself as a unit. On the second hand, unconscious awareness of her subjection to others. She's a guerrilla fighter because all are others who validate her if she adopts this identity. When she gives up the guerrilla and her guerrilla partners leave her house and apparently everything returns to calm, she realized that she cannot share this experience with the group, and that makes her feel alone, without a place of belonging and far from Felipe. So in the following chapters, Lavinia turns to the idea of being part of the guerrilla. She struggles to try to clarify her contradictions. On the one hand, her narcissistic system pushes her to maintain a relationship with the character she admires. In addition, she is influenced by her conscious desire to move away from the high-class ideas that her parents have tried to instill in her since childhood. Also maintaining her ideas of breaking with the traditional gender roles. This breaking makes her feeling insecure, because she was afraid. But mainly it is the fear of loneliness to overcome the fear to die. During the novel, she joins the guerrilla for Felipe, but she moves away both physically and psychologically from her previous networks. Near the end of the novel, we have two really important events that occur. The first one is when Lavinia calls her mother. In a moment of anguish due to the loneliness, Lavinia decides to call her mom and talk to her. Then she feels able to say what she didn't not manage to verbalize as a child. Instead of being a silent child waiting to be loved by her mom, she voices her need to be cared for and loved. But this time, being able to position her mother as another woman of the same level as herself. At the moment, Lavinia discovers her mother's desire to be loved. You only loved her, says the mother, referring to Auntie Ness. This misunderstanding is a wound in the mother's narcissism. She sees herself as a bad mother and defeated by a third part, Auntie Ness. This experience was kept in silence by both of them, fostering distance and suffering in their life. The second event is Felipe's death. In the midst of her mourning process, she decides to return to the guerrilla with the expectation of finding acceptance and recognition in the group. But this time, she's not guided so much by the fear of loneliness as by self-acceptance. So through this analysis, we can find three conclusions. The first one is the emotional regulation mechanism that Lavinia uses. This would be positive mechanism for her as they reduce her anguish caused by her loneliness and disagreement. Some of these regulations would be through attachment to idealized figures, Felipe, the guerrilla partners, or Auntie Ness. Some defense mechanism for the projection of her anguish or discomfort onto significant others, and the self-acceptance. Lavinia gradually feels valuable to the point that her narcissistic motivation overrides those of self-preservation, and she decided to put her life at risk for her social cause. This is all. This is all I'm gonna. Okay, now. That's it.
Thank you, Elena. That's also a very interesting paper. So our third speaker here is Christina Rabu. Christina holds a PhD in literary theory from the Academy of Sciences of Moldova, and she is currently working on her second PhD in Francophone studies. Her dissertation is tentatively titled, I will say it in English, my French now. Okay, Sickness and Story, the narrativation of the sick body in contemporary Quebecese body in contemporary Quebecese fiction, and it explores the pain narratives in Quebec literature and cinema. Her research interests are medical humanities, Quebec study, literary and critical theory, culture study, and French moderns and contemporary literature in cinema. So her title today is Care and Chronotope, reflecting on the space-time of the care in Seigneur Amer by Conessa Yonsi.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks. I was going to say good morning, realizing that it's the afternoon for most of you where you are. So good afternoon and good morning from here. I'm going to talk today about care and the chronotope, and I'm going to reflect on time and space of care. And I'm going to start right away. The ongoing pandemic made us all go through a significant shift in our perception and experience of time and space. On different levels and in idiosyncratic ways, we were and still are disconnected from our usual environments and time flows. We discovered the complex manner in which we have to navigate our lives while being limited. From the confines of our chairs, in which we are even now, we had to shift through our different statuses, social positions, and deadlines. The chair represents a dialectical space, a dialectical site, in the clinical space, particularly in psychiatric sickness narratives. In positioning the participants, the doctor and the patient respectively, the chair is the locus which allows to situate the voices, agencies, and the power dynamics between them. With her dual background in medicine and literature, the psychiatrist and poet Wanessa Yunsi operates as both a doctor and a patient in order to reflect on time and space of sickness as they are perceived, so objectified and lived, experienced. In her fictional but also somewhat theoretical text, Soigner Aimer, which translates as To Care, to Love, published in 2016, Yunsi retraces her professional and personal journey in the clinical time space and expresses the importance of each experience through different registers of language and specific space-time. According to Yunsi, and I'm going to quote, have the quote in French, but you have the translations of all the quotes in English on the PowerPoint. So according to Yunsi, I'm quoting, La psychiatrie nous apprend souvent que nous sommes sur cette chaise pour y rester, qu'un fossé nous sépare de celle du patient. Cela est faux, seule une poignée de gènes, d'atomes et d'expériences nous distinguent l'un de l'autre. Nous pouvons toujours basculer, cette chaise de soignant ne nous appartient pas, elle nous est prêtée. End quote. By rendering this position, so the chair, the doctor's position in the chair impermanent and the space-time of the chair permeable, Yunsi deconstructs and recrafts the image of the psychiatrist while injecting it with poetic language and inserting both doubt and empathy. The narrator's attunement to her patient's vulnerability reveals her own background and produces what Ursula Mathis-Moser calls une écriture ultra-lucide, mais qui refuse les engagements bruts et moralisants. End quote. This paper presents and briefly explores the complexities of lived and narrated space-time in Yussi's Soigner Aimer, using the Bakhtinian concept of the chronotope and its variants, which I will present in a second, in order to show how experiences and languages, both the medical and the poetic, construct, define, and transcend the doctor-patient position and exposes their limitation. So the chronotope, theorized by Mikhail Bakhtin, the chronotope, so literally time-space, and I'm quoting, is the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature, end quote. So thus the chronotope is a constructive element through which clinical encounters are shaped, positioned, and portrayed. Each chronotope situates the exact location and temporality of the characters in the doctor-patient paradigm according to the obligations and limitations of their statuses and discloses the particularities of their experience. In his book, Language of Those Who Have Nothing, Mikhail Bakhtin and the Landscape of Psychiatry, Peter Good identifies and defines a dyad, the care chronotope and the patient's chronotope, which speak to the dichotomy of experiences and translate the positions or the roles of each participant according to Talcott Parsons. This particular critical framework allows a manifold reading of the clinical space or spaces, of the encounters, exchanges, and forms of care. According to Good, and I'm going to start quoting in a bit, the care chronotope is the dominant one, and it is defined as, and I'm quoting, highly visible construct made up of a variety of practitioners and office spaces. And this chronotope is constructed by linear time and tightly bound spaces, which I quote again, tiered with exact points of entry and exit, meetings, consultations, duty time on and off, the tasks of administration and day-to-day institutional routines, end quote. The care chronotope is formed by the authoritative while at time opposing voices, which create the official discourse of psychiatry. By opposition, the patient's chronotope is seen as much less strict because, as Good sees it, and I quote, any entry into this chronotope is clouded by biographical narratives of resistance, anxiety, betrayal, or even in the surrendering of concern, end quote. So this chronotope has unstable time and circular spaces in which the patient is asked to comply, passively accept, and fulfill the expectation of the voice of the care chronotope. The voices constructing the patient's chronotope are unofficial, subaltern, requiring a different language and different interpretations. While they're presented as a dichotomy, more or less in Good's point of view, it is possible to shift from one chronotope to the other, something that we can see unfold in Yunsi's powerful autofictional texts. So while the narrator of Soigner is presented from the incipit as a psychiatrist and the text is designated as autofictional, thus as beginning from the space-time of care, from the position of the doctor, in the 19 texts which construct the narrative, she also exits this time-space and explores her own experience with eating disorders, mental illness, and the loss of loved ones. Yunsi builds her narrative identity by weaving those aspects of her life and situating interpersonal relationships as a center of all forms of care. While maintaining her position as a medical authority, she invests it with an experiential and poetic side, which is a form of sensitivity that allows her to make a precise and moving chronicle of her dual professional career, so the medical and the literary. This allows her to situate her poetic and political desire to transcend binaries while making her clinical space-time her clinical space-time with a form of co-presence of the other being the patient. It involves sharing the vulnerability of the other and represents the possibility of investing the official psychiatric chronotope and its discourse with elements of the patient's time-space. The shift from her posture of medical authority towards that of an ally who experiences concern for her patients and is mediated through her repositioning herself in the patient's chronotope. And I'm going to go to my first quote. Again, I'm going to quote the French and you have the English. Je tente de me mettre à leur place, sentir l'aiguille pénétrer mes fesses. L'allopéridol et le lorazépam m'injectent la paix, sointer dans ma chair, rejoindre mes neurones, se lier à mes récepteurs. End quote. For the narrator being in their place, feeling the effect of drugs on her own flesh and experiencing it in terms of a different temporality and spatiality represents a form of connectedness to her patients and relating to their reality of the experienced clinical landscape. This speaks to what, according to Good, is the official structure of the psychiatric time-space. The matter where one, and I'm quoting Good in this moment, the matter of where one sits and on what part of the landscape one occupies is the principal component of a body's standing in relationship to others. For Yunxi's narrator, the ability of sitting in the other's place is a form of connectedness, of care, and of cure. It is a proximity which allows the emotional to infiltrate the medical. In order for this connectedness to be possible, she reads her patients. And I have another quote. À chaque aube, je retrouve Andy assis sur la même chaise de l'unité, comme s'il n'avait pas bougé depuis la veille. Il patiente, extatique, le corps fendant, la chair se répandant sur la chair devenant la chaise, suée, odeur d'un homme qui ne se lave plus. Chaque matin, je lui apporte un verre d'eau. Chaque matin, il le boit. Par ce mince geste, je me sens liée. The stillness of the patient is interpreted and understood by the doctor who sets up care rituals, so the glass of water, and invests in her connectedness with him and his space-time, so his flesh basically becoming this patient's chair. But this link to the other is experienced and is expanded also from the individual and the interpersonal relationships of doctor-patient to a historical and decolonial paradigm. While narrating her visit to an indigenous reservation, Washat, the narrator realizes that in caring for some of her patients, for indigenous patients especially, she will have to treat more than the here and now of this medical encounter, of the illness, because, and I'm quoting, on recommence à soigner les plaies de 4 siècles, referring obviously to the historical colonial space which Canada represents. Thus, her clinical practice expands outside the space-time of the actions of care into the transgenerational traumas lived by the indigenous people of North America. Thus, Yunxi's narrator operates in the decolonial paradigm of the ethics of care, which is obviously, according to Toronto and Gilligan, and a feminist type of ethic. So this connectedness is made possible not only through her medical practice, but also through her own otherness, which is her Berber heritage and her experience of anorexia as a young patient. And I'm quoting, Je consultais une médecin à contre-cœur, salle d'attente grise, chaise, patient et revue châtelaine à l'infini, jeu pour enfants, bal rose, bleu, rouge, jaune, des heures à patienter parmi les couleurs, mon nom déformé par les haut-parleurs, sursaut, tremblement, entrée déshonorée dans le bureau comme dans un confessionnal, tête basse. End quote. As we can see from this quote portraying Yunxi's narrator experience, her experience as a patient, as a young patient, the subject-object in the space-time of the patient are multiple, exposed, and vulnerable. This shows the way in which time, so we have the waiting room, salle d'attente, is stretched, where you need to wait, and the space, so the chairs and everything else are multiple, and the patient's chronotype is immovable and sort of alienating. This markers of the chronotype reveal a precariousness of the patient's relation to the space-time they entered, and as a result of this experience, the narrator's ability to connect to her patients as a caregiver later in her life. This is presented in the proleptic end of this particular section I just quoted in an encounter with her own patient named Jay, and I'm going to quote, J'entame ma 3e année comme psychiatre, je vieillis, j'aime soigner. Vous ne pouvez pas comprendre, moi, c'est vrai, si vous permettez, j'aimerais quand même essayer. Soigner, écrire, se réfère l'amour de la fragilité, j'ira mieux. End quote. So for Yunxi, this understanding of the other is filtered through her own experience as increased by literature itself, both its production, because she's writing this text, and its consumption. As Alexandre Geffen sees it, the character of the doctor is an ancient one, but the novelty in contemporary literature, which I study in my dissertation, is the desire to connect the medical and literary practices. In the epilogue to the text, the narrator ponders on the way in which literature sharpens his sensitivity and her understanding of the other. In reading the poet Alejandra Pizarnik, for example, the narrator expresses a similar feeling of recognition of the pain of the other. I'm sorry. I'm going to go here. Je t'accompagne, Alejandra, dans les couloirs de l'hôpital psychiatrique où tu essaies la chimie. Je me métamorphose, je ne suis plus dans la chaise du docteur. En te lisant, Alejandra, je ressens la folie, je deviens folle moi-même, je me découvre insoupçonnée, neuve. Quelqu'un parle de moi sans parler de moi. Les psychés se transforment, je sens une autre moi, end quote. So this connectedness is illustrated here in a form of mise en abîme. Yunsi's psychiatrist narrator, so this character relates to the patient narrator presented by Pizarnik's poetic representation of illness, and the care chronotope dissolves in the poetic landscape of the patient's chronotope. So as we can see, participating in the chronotropic shifts are both the connection to her actual patients and to the literary representation of sickness. Thus, literature is here a gateway to the other, to the experience of illness, and has the potential to repair the world, as the title of Alexandre Jechen's book goes. So these three positions, the doctor, the patient, or the emphasizing with the patient, and losing someone because she lost her grandmother, are each exposed in different literary forms. So there's prose mixed with journal entries, and there's poetry because she's a poet. Thus exploring specific attachments, discursive styles, and literary practices which correspond to those. Following this exploration of the psychiatric landscape, we can see that while the dichotomy care chronotope and patient's chronotope is valid and useful in analyzing sickness narrative, pathographies, and other related forms of textualizations, they are not disconnected from each other. According to Peter Good, so often practitioners find themselves entering the clinic on a purely intellectual level, end quote, which doesn't happen in Yunsi's narrative. But following this chronotopic reading, we can see that Yunsi's narrative alter ego is a healthcare worker and a writer who inhabits both the care space-time and that of the patient with love, attention, and care. This comes from the connection between the self and the other, the traversing of the specific limits and preconceptions which populate the landscape of psychiatry. Literature provides the psychiatrist with the resources to connect to the fictional other, while her own experience as a patient and that of her loved ones makes it possible for her to circulate between those positions and space-times in order to attend to her own patients in a more humane, contextualized, and informed way. Believing that, and I quote, the psychiatrist, like the poet, puts words on a set of signs, Yunsi explores, traverses, and reconfigures the chronotopes of care and that of the patient through this autofictional narrative and explores her ethics and poetics of care and connectedness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. All three papers, a very, very interesting paper. Thank you for all your paper. And now, you all three ready for questions? So we open for questions. So yeah, you can either raise your hand so that, I can see it, and we can start. Any question? Let me see the chat if there's any question. Right, so perhaps I will start first. Didn't see any hand there. So yeah, I really interested in knowing about autonosis. Francesca, when you explained about, how you break it through about auto itself and then gnosis, how this, like when you said self-knowledge, so I was trying to put we have a person or a body, a patient or a woman, for example, any like female sickness, for instance. And then does that mean that we have to be aware of self-knowledge rather than just, anything happened to us and then just submit ourselves to the medicals, whatever the doctors or nurses or the medicals perceive you. How can you kind of like explain more in terms of that self-knowledge or the autonosis?
Good question. So yeah, I mean, that question is sort of the crux of where the concept comes from, is this idea, from my own experience. I had spent a lot of time thinking that a diagnosis was going to be some kind of answer to almost like an existential question. And a lot of work around, the particular diagnosis that I look at is borderline personality disorder. And a lot of the work that's done around that is more done about dismantling that as a concept and sort of pushing back against the patriarchal elements of the way it's constructed, which I don't disagree with. But if I want to recognize that there is an experience that I would, that I feel does fit, I might not use the medical language that they've used, but I think there is an experience that fits some of the things they're describing. I think they're describing what I experience. I don't like how they're describing it. And so then the question comes, well, then I should describe it. It doesn't, you don't have to reject that there is a recognition of an experience in order to reject the kind of pathologization of that experience. So this idea of autonosis was about trying to speak from an experience while also recognizing some of the things about that experience that make it difficult to speak from, such as these senses of multiplicitous or shifting or appearing and disappearing selves. How do you self-define when you're not speaking from a kind of firm ground? And that's one of the reasons that I find Hedva so interesting, because they are saying, speak from there. That's fine. You don't have to pin it down in order to allow it to exist.
Thank you. Anyone's, Elena or Chris, want to add on that? Is it relates on any of your research, you think?
I have, I want to relate to that. And then I have a question to Francesca to follow up on that. It's interesting because in my own experience, and I've been working on sickness narratives for a very long time, the idea was almost very patriarchal that the diagnosis is needed. I'm going to be saved when I have a diagnosis. And this is how I feel in my own, when I have something, when something hurts, I really want to go to the doctor and see what's wrong. So I realized how I attach, and how in a lot of my the fictions I am working with, the attachment to the patriarchal labeling of what it is. What does the doctor or what does the book say about it? So where I wanted to come back to you and to everything you were talking about, Francesca, and my idea was, you mentioned the names were there, but you didn't talk about affect theory as such. So my question and the direction I wanted to go in is, the affect theory has this part of it that goes beyond or behind the labels, right? And it talks about spaces and dynamics and affects in a very different manner, which sort of rang a bell in what you were talking about. So I wanted to ask you about your use of affect theory as such, both in your work, in your theoretical work, and in your experience as a person with borderline personality. How does the affect itself and the literary side of it, the writing about it, how does that influence, and what is the impact on what you do? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, that's a really good question. I think we have a lot of overlap actually. In the so writing about Hedva here is kind of an extension of trying to think with autonosis now that I've come up with it. But in the actual thesis, I think with a lot of different texts, including Pisanic. So I was very excited to hear her mentioned there. Yeah, so affect theory. So I have two PhD supervisors. One of them is the film affect theorist Kristen Garton. So she has been kind of an influence. But yeah, I think affect theory is very good for, like you say, kind of thinking about these. I'm trying to remember the phrase. An affect theory reader, the introductory essay talks about shimmers or something. You know, it's this kind of trying to find language to describe experience that doesn't have to be nailed down. Again, I'm using that term in these emotions. And I think one of the things that I've always found very troubling and frustrating about when people talk about borderline personality disorder is when they really highlight emotions. It's about emotions. It's about people who are too emotional or something like that. And there's less interest in what we call it, what's too emotional, by which they mean people who experience affects or levels of intensity of affect that are non-normative. I guess that's what they mean by too emotional. I mean, the UK definition of BPD is emotionally unstable personality disorder, which for someone like me who's very interested in these ideas of shifting selves and the sort of more dissociative side, and you know, these parts of it are being kind of more and more pushed out in favor of emotion. So I think I like affect because it doesn't dismiss what again, it's about people trying to describe the same thing I'm trying to describe, but I don't like the way they squeeze it into these boxes, you know. And affect is much more, it's very embodied, it's also very literary, as you say. There's and I think writing is one of the, you know, the ways that we can kind of access our own affects after the fact, you know, or in the fact.
Elena, do you want to add anything on that? Do you have?
Actually, I'm really interested in what she's saying, but I think I cannot add anything about it.
Okay.
Because my team is kind of far away from this.
Right. So, Linda Miller here. Chris, I think it's for you. I think you can see that. Can you read the chat there? Do you want me to read it or can you read it? Okay.
Okay, so I'm reading Linda Miller's message. Sorry I missed the first two talks. Chris, I am interested in the doctor-patient. You cited good, saying so often practitioners find themselves entering the clinic on a purely intellectual level. What is the evidence that this is founded on? I think the reality of the clinicians is much more than ENC is describing, balancing empathy in the shoes of compassion, pro-social, and the relational clinic decision making. Thank you so much, Linda. So the evidence on this, Good is a psychiatrist. So his endeavor and his discovery of his experience, I guess, both as a psychiatrist, as a practitioner, and then as a person who looks at the chronotopes of the people around him, which are the patients. His idea was to map it on those two different sides, so the doctor and the patient. And this is a great book because what he does further in his text is enter a psychiatrical clinic as a patient. So he, as a doctor, decides to do to test the chronotype of the patient and to enter in a psychiatrical institution and to test those spaces and times as they're lived by the patient. So this is something that I was really interested in. Obviously, the theoretical framework was very interesting to me. As it was mentioned before, I have a degree and I have a PhD in literary theory, so I'm very interested in theoretical elements, the building blocks, let's say, of narratives, which time and space consist are the main elements of. So in this case, there's definitely empathy and balancing empathy, but also knowledge. So that authoritative horizontal type of knowledge versus the other types of authoritative voices in the chronotype of the doctor. What happens here is, I think, that Good tried to make this binary and then deconstruct it a little bit more, which I try to, in terms, see even more in the text of Quebec writers. And there's a further element to this, which is where in a women writers conference, it happens much more in women writers than in who are also doctors than in male writers, in my experience. So the tendency for male doctors is to have this linear narrative with the authoritative voice of the doctor describing the patients, in a very traditional and clinical manner, while by oppositions like Yunsi and a bunch of other women writers, the tendency is to deconstruct and to sort of fragment the voices of authority and the time space, this clinical time space in which everything is linear and correct, and their entry points and exit points and everything is very well defined. Women's writing has the tendency to go beyond that, to sort of deconstruct it and to see it from different perspectives. And so this is the thing. Good's book and his theoretical framework, I think, helps sort of going into that and seeing how this thing in theory and again in practice in his own book, but it's a theoretical book. In the narratives that I look at, the things are a little bit different, but just as interesting. So I'm happy to answer any other questions that are regarded to this, and I highly recommend both Good and Bakhtin, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Right. Any more questions? Anyone? You can ask each other questions, you know.
I had a tiny question for Elena and then another question for Francesca. In Elena's case, I was wondering about the I think you're saying that the location, so the mapping of the place where the narrative takes place is a fictional one, right? It's not an actual country or actual space. And because I've been talking about time space, I was wondering thus, what does it do to the text and to the representation of this character, the fact that it's fictional? How it would have it changed if it were a real time and a real space, and if it does something to portray this feminine character in a different way? And I'm going to just ask Francesca right away, so then you have the time to think about it. Francesca, I had a question. You quoted Derrida and you talk about aporia, which is a very Derridian notion. And I was thinking about another Derridian way of seeing things, which is la différence, the classic différence. And I was wondering about that différence, that other letter, that otherness that is inscripted, that you can hear, but you can see, but not always. So all of those elements that are very Derridian and complex. How is there a way you do connect it, or you think you can connect it, about the seen and the unseen and the spoken and the unspoken? Because you've mentioned it a lot. And when I think, this is why I asked you about literature earlier, literature has this possibility of making things seen and also unseen, like complexifying them to a degree that things are so deconstructed and it's so hard to really, and here goes, I go back to the question I asked Elena. There are some fictional spaces, fictional times, nothing is real and things can't really be seen or touch or experience. So I was wondering about that. Thank you both.
Actually, the place is fictional, obviously the character are too, but this author, what the author makes is to create a fictional space, but the real space is Nicaragua. So it's just doing a parallel comparative between Faguas and Nicaragua. But if she wanted to publish her book, it was impossible at the time to say it is Nicaragua. This is Nicaragua. For example, Isabel Allende, I studied she too. She had the same problem. But she didn't name the country. She didn't wrote Chile in any point of the book. So even if the place is fictional, or the character too, it is really recognizable. We can recognize that the country is this, And it is really interesting between because she makes a parallel comparative between in this moment the present history and the past history. There is another character really important. I couldn't talk about her because it was another thing. It is Itza, who is an Indian woman who fights against Spanish colonization. So even what is really interesting of this book is really, even if it is fictional, it can make the reality closer to the people who read it, to the readers. It is a bestseller. She could make closer the history to the readers, and she creates a very important character with this one, because even if Lavinia is a high-class woman, and she was living in her bubble, she was studying in Europe, and she became a guerrilla fighter, just because she wanted to be with her romantic partner more time. Suddenly, her bubble got broken, and actually she was living in a fictional place, even into the novel. So the character was living into a fictional place, placed into another fictional place. So for that, I don't know if I'm talking in circles, but that's the point.
So I will follow suit from Chris and ask you each a question, and then I will answer Chris's question, so that gives you both time to think about what I said. Elena, I might have missed it at the beginning, so you may have mentioned something, but I was interested because you were thinking with a lot of psychoanalytic theory. I was interested maybe like which particular figures, and again, I might have missed this, if there are particular theorists or particular schools of psychoanalysis that you're thinking with. That would be really interesting to me. I have a background in psychoanalysis. That was my master's. So yeah, and to Chris, quite selfishly, because part of my work is on Alejandro Pizarnik, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that aspect. So if I get it right, the character in the narrative reads Pizarnik. Yeah. I thought it was interesting that you brought up Mise en Abîme, because I also talk about that in relation to Pizarnik, because she's obsessed with mirrors, and so am I, and so is my thesis. So I'm really interested in that the fact that you also brought that out in relation to her. So to respond to the question about Derrida, so I'm not, as my undergrad was in literature, I teach in literature now, as anyone who's in that world, we all know the Derridian kind of 101, but I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool Derridian. My partner is becoming one, and he keeps telling me all of these Derridian things. But in the final chapter of the thesis, I look at Clarice Lispector, and I bring each text that I look at has a companion psychoanalyst. So with Lispector, of course, it is Cixous, because Cixous wrote so much about Lispector, and that is kind of the way, that's kind of the window through which Derrida finds his way into my work, is kind of more through Cixous, who is, very much taking a lot of what he did, but in a particularly feminist direction, because I'm in the Centre for Women's Studies at York, so it's a very, very feminist-informed project. I'll hand it over to the two of you.
I can go first. Thank you for your question. So I was actually checking to see if the words of Alejandra are actually in the book because I couldn't remember. And I was talking about mise en abîme. Yes, I was saying, so this patient, this doctor narrator reads the poet narrator, and it is a mise en abîme. It is, and the whole text is dripping with literary references and with the poetry, a lot of poetic and poets of Quebec and of the Francophone world, but not only, and a lot of obviously medical jargon. So this is the interesting part, that there is this mise en abîme of a poet's experience in the text, which is then put side by side with the medical jargon and with this whole experience of this used to be patient, now doctor, who's also a poet. And what happens in here, and why I thought I'd bring it up, obviously, I think everyone realized that I had a penchant for chairs, and this was my leitmotif today, because I thought we're just spending our lives in chairs this time around. But so yes, the chair was there, and this was part of my interest. But more than that, I was thinking about this positioning, again, the poet and the doctor sitting in their chairs and thinking of all those things, but also the doctor and the patient, right? So this web of references and of connections. And one more thing, you mentioned Sixu, and I was thinking, and I wanted to mention it, but not enough time, about this feminine writing, the fabric of the text, the way the texts are cut and stopped, or they go forever. So the ways in which the fabric of the text itself is made, the UNC's text I'm talking right now, it reminds of a lot of other, so there are a lot of other voices, and it goes against this clear scientific jargon of a doctor. So I think this is what she does with the taking Alejandra's text into it. So that Alejandra's voice is in the text. There are quotes of poetry. And as I mentioned in UNC's text, there's a chapter that's written in poetry, which when she talks about losing her grandmother. So the poetic element, again, talking about mise en abîme, the elements, theoretical elements, reflect the actual practice of literature, and same for care, and same for healthcare, basically. So all of those things are sort of crafted, and they go together. I hope I answered to this.
Okay, in my case, what I used for this character representation analysis was the Freud understanding of narcissism, because he uses this term in two different ways. The first one is as self-esteem, and the second one is a relationship with the others. And for this complex character, as Lavinia is, it is really useful because this is the two parts that I needed. So that's what I use for this paper.
All right, thank you. I like the dialogue between three of you, you know, how you share your, you know, your work and knowledge, you know, learn from each other. I have one question for Elena. If I'm not wrong, when I see your presentation, you said that Felipe is the, like a Lavina, a desire and central object is saying about that. Then I just want to see, because can you elaborate more in terms of the desire and the central object of Felipe towards Lavina?
Yeah, sure. When she was, she's always needed for a attachment figure. Of course, when we are kids, when we are in our childhood, we can have our mother, father, aunt, whoever. And even if she was studying in Europe, she was still a needy person. So when she arrived to a new context, as was the architecture office when she started to work, and she met Felipe, she gave Felipe all the values that she was needed to. Yeah. For example, she thought he was the example of wisdom, physical strength, psychological strength. And even if she was an adult, she gave him all the power of her life. So she wasn't just in love with him. he was her new father, we can say, because she was always looking for advice, looking for a help. She even became a guerrilla fighter just for sharing more time with him and for get her pleased. So she wasn't responsible of her self-life until he died. When he's dead, she noticed that she's not only preserving herself, as she has arrived to a acceptance. She's an adult, and now she can take her own decisions, make her own decisions.
Thank you. And relate to that, you also said about the defense mechanism. Do you think, because I didn't read the books, but I was just thinking about the characters, do you think that Lavinia action is actually the lack of father's figures and mother figures in her life? Is it the idea of her behave in such?
Yeah, because even as she was so distant from her parents, she was raised by her aunt, and she developed a powerful imagination, and her brain was in another fiction place. So she was always living like if the others were just there for her. So her behavior is always really affected by her parents' lack. Even it's sad, the character that I mentioned before, that it's not possible to talk to her in this paper. She's represented by a tree, and the fruit of the tree is eaten by Lavinia, and the spirit is inside her blood. So this kind of, and she gave her the powerful, this powerful new attitude. So Lavinia is really affected by imagination, by even kind of illusion, and this parents' lack.
Thank you. I don't know. I didn't read a book. I would read a book. It sounds like she's there, but she's not there. Like her body is there, but her mind is somewhere else. That you're talking about the space and the body.
Even between fiction and not fiction.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Elena. And we still have about 8 minutes. I was just thinking that maybe, Chris, if we don't have any question, do we have any? No, we don't.
I had a tiny follow-up for Elena. I just wanted to ask you something that has been very controversial and discussed a lot about Latin America writers, especially. Is it considered to be magical realism? Is it what you're just talking about it, about being and not being and all that? And I've been reading something recently about it, of the quarrels about labeling names. So I was wondering, is that it?
Yeah, it is so discussed. It is like the big question always. Actually, this author is a post-boom author, and she's a daughter, we can say, from this boom Latin American writers, and of course from the realistic literature, magic realistic literature. So even if it is not a real magic realistic book, sorry, I knew this word just in Spanish, I'm so sorry. It is really affected. Yeah, okay. It is really similar.
Thank you so much.
Chris, there is I think Linda Miller asked, thank you, I will read good. Is Yanis available in English translation?
I answered to Linda, but I just realized that it was a
right.
private message. So just to answer this,
okay,
it was not,
right.
So
it was not if I want to read,
yet.
So I know that it's in English now. Okay, but we still have time. I just have one thing that there's a quote that you put in your presentation, Chris, and you said that something about space, that it is it the chair that is not, it is not belong to us, it is loaned to us. So can you kind of like elaborate more on that? Because I like that quote, like it's like this world, not belong to us, it's just loaned. So how you want to perform it, so that space. So can you please?
I think this goes back to, thank you so much for the question. Again, the chair was, was the idea. what I wanted to do, and what I think Analysing wants to do with this, is to present this permeable and this vulnerable state or position, which is the doctor, and to sort of deconstruct and go against the idea that you are as a doctor, you're in this position forever, you have this authority forever, and just, and coming back to Good, he talks about this idea that whenever a psychiatrist have a breakdown, a mental illness problems, when they want to talk about it, be that in autobiographical, autofictional, or other type of text, they are discouraged to do so, or they do it anonymously because they just don't want to sort of expose this vulnerability, which goes against the hierarchical and very structured institutional demands. And I wanted to introduce another text in this very short presentation. I was not able to. I'm going to just talk about it for a second now because it has to do with this. Catherine Raymond, another Quebec author, wrote a text that's called Matricide. She's also a psychiatrist, and she talks about her mother's suicide and her own trying to commit suicide because of this. So her own distress, her own depression, her own anxiety, and then her own trying to take her life, on which it doesn't work, and she comes back in her own hospital as a patient. So the attitude and the understanding, going back to the space time I was talking about, so the way to traverse directly, not as in Yunsi's case, the narrator had anorexia when she was very young, so she sort of goes back to that idea and remembers the doctor's authority, while in Catherine Raymond's text, she actually comes back to the same hospital she worked in a couple of days ago. So again, changing and coming back to the chair idea, how do you reposition yourself in that other chair? What does it take to do so? What does it mean to do so, for your job, as in a very capitalist and structured way, but for your affective life? What does that mean to sort of detach yourself from the authority that was given to you and have the possibility of being forced, as in Catherine Raymond's case, to go on the other chair? And so this is the idea. And again, coming back to women writers, I think this happened in my readings and in everything I've done in Quebec literature, especially, and film. The women have this tendency to deconstruct this position much more. I'll have to continue reading. I'm almost done with my dissertation, but we're always reading. So I have to see how this sort of evolves and how things happen. But for now, this is what I have. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So all the books that you just recommend, Christina, just now, is it in English as well, or?
They're all French. I'm working on a French Canada, so
right. Yeah. Okay.
But they're really good books, and because of Canada being what it is, I'm sure they will be translated at some point. They're very recent, so I don't think it happened just yet.
Yeah, I like the idea when it's reversed, isn't it? Like you have the authority, and then suddenly you are there. So how do you perform in this new space?
And both of these narratives are autofictional, let's put it like that. There's a lot of autobiographical elements. Obviously, they're narrated and they're refocalized. So it's not supposed to be a clear theoretical history of the person, but there's a lot of, it translates or it interprets the medical or the clinical space, especially psychiatry, and it shows it from a different perspective, from a different chair.
Yeah, different chairs in the chair. It's very, very interesting. Anything else? Any of the other speakers want to say anything before we close? We have like 1 minute before we say goodbye to everyone. And the next we have like a workshop or something, or is it a speaker? So yeah. Anything else?
I just want to say thank you to everyone, to the other panelists, and to you, Sharina. It was a really good almost little round table that we got going there. It was really nice. And thank you everyone else that was watching.
All right.
Thank you very much, everyone. And hope you have a good sitting in your chairs for the rest of the conference.
So yeah, I would like to thank all the three speakers and all the participants. And it's a very nice dialogue there, and I like it. So thank you very much. So I see you in the next panels. Oh, yeah, all right.
Hi everyone, welcome to last day of the Contemporary Women's Writing and Medical Humanities conference. This morning we have a brilliant panel, 3 papers that really gel well together. I'm really excited to have the speakers here today for panel 5C, The Undying and Boyer's Impact on Illness Narratives, with a bit of Sinead Gleeson appearing as well. Something that we'll also be doing is just brief auto description. So for example, I'll just quickly describe myself. So 30-year-old, you don't have to give your age, by the way, I don't know why I give it, but 30-year-old British woman with gold glasses, plaits, and like a kind of black sweater vest thing and a flowery top on. So I will introduce now the first speaker. Each of the speakers will speak for about 15 minutes or so. We'll do all of the speakers all the way through, the 3 of them, and then at the end we'll do a group Q&A, and this session should go on until about 11 a.m. BST. So our first speaker is Kat Chong. Kat Chong is a poet, publisher and proud queer crip. They're a graduate of the Poetic Practice MA at Royal Holloway and current PhD student at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, where their work is committed to the intersections of disability, gender nonconformity, and lyric intervention. Their interests include ecology, gender, health, contemporary poetics, medical humanities, lyric essays, and crip theory. So I'll hand it over to Kat now.
Thank you. I will quickly share my screen. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that introduction. Just to provide a brief audio description, with my age, in solidarity, I am a 24-year-old mixed Chinese-British non-binary person with dyed white hair, very dark brown roots, and I am wearing a dark green shirt, which I'm very aware looks close to black in this lighting. It is an honor to be on this panel today. Thank you, Ben, thank you, Becky, for making this possible. In the following paper, I would like to talk about expressions and literary representations of physical pain, to explore the difficulty in conveying it beyond metric calculation as an encounter that defies numerical translation. In particular, I want to consider the strategies of rewriting medical languages and the metrics of pain which attempt to make suffering measurable within a clinical setting. Anne Boyer's The Undying and Sinead Gleeson's Constellations defy generic expectations of illness narratives as transparent chronological texts written in a confessional register. In response, I hope to use the creative critical form of the lyric essay as an exploratory mode through which to expand, refuse, and complicate conceptions of pain and genre. Representing pain as a revisional encounter and a generative constraint, I hope to rethink the possibilities of the disabled imagination that might be possible from within the ongoing state of agony. In doing so, my motives are entirely selfish. I have an undiagnosed chronic pain condition, and the endeavor to represent and express pain from the perspective of a disabled, queer, non-white, and non-cisgendered body is an intimate one. To conceptualize alternative intersectional ways of knowing which decenter mainstream epistemologies remains a praxis from which I cannot claim any critical distance. This constitutes part of a wider project, and I'd very much welcome feedback and suggestions. Within Where Does It Hurt? 20 Stories based on the McGill Pain Index, Gleeson foregrounds the limitations of the vocabulary of the index, investigating each of the adjectives, their histories, their relation to the female body, and the authorship of the register. Enacting a poetic intervention, she infuses the lexicon with anecdotal imagery from intimate moments already related in prose in previous chapters, connecting her body intrinsically to the categories, expanding their context to encompass her motherhood, disability, and women's experiences of medicine more widely. The McGill Pain Index was developed in 1971 by Ronald Melzack and Warren Torgerson. It's a list of 78 words in 20 sections developed from Melzack's research visiting patients in the pain clinic at the University of Oregon Medical School. Intrigued by the patients he meets, he records their descriptions of pain in singular adjectives. As he states in the McGill Pain Questionnaire, from description to measurement, by the time I'd left, I possessed more than 100 words, but I had no idea what to do with them. I knew that patients with different pain syndromes used different sets of descriptors, and more intense pains were described with more words. Mostly, I saw them as evidence of the complexity of pain's mechanisms. Referring to the operation of pain within multiple pathways and structures, The McGill Pain Index attempts to serve as a questionnaire that would provide credible evidence of the perceived subjective qualities of a person's pain. While pain is not genre-specific, in crystallizing a medical vocabulary for describing how a part of the body hurts, the index has made a generic lexicon through which to evaluate pain's credibility. While providing a selection of verbs as a concrete mechanism, the vocabulary for pain, Gleason seems to be suggesting, cannot be monolithic as well as sufficient. In Constellations, her poems vary wildly in register, spacing, and form. However, they're all citational, referencing experiences of pain that have already played out in prose in the previous chapters. Pain, Gleason proposes, is flexible. She's unable to confine it within any one singular structure. The patient is free, she says, to select multiple words, but pain cannot be reduced to one lexical bracket. In this indeterminacy, Gleason subverts the precise and fixed metaphors within the biomedical vocabulary for pain. Each poem subtitle notating a procedure, diagnosis, side effect, or other form of wounding underneath the sensory bracket. These poems tear into the framework of the index through a direct interpellation of the reader, asking, how many times have you been in pain? Did you have all the words you needed to tell the story of it? The poems vary massively in length too. The shortest, dull, sore, hurting, aching, heavy, not breastfeeding, comprises of just 7 words across 4 lines. Heparin, cabbage leaves, the sadness, the judgment. The sparsity of language leaves the negative space of the page as an unfilled blank that it seems almost too ashamed to talk into, the weight of the sadness and judgment compacting the poem against the left margin. The list simultaneously recalls heparin, an anticoagulant she injects to prevent the formation of blood clots, and cabbage leaves, which are sometimes used to treat mastitis, engorgement, and increase the duration of breastfeeding. The poem also denotes an anxiety through the juxtaposition of curative efforts besides the judgment and shame she experiences when a nurse dismisses her concerns over the many drugs she's taken being transmitted to her son via breastfeeding. Hundreds of drugs have sluiced through my body, many of them highly toxic. It plays on my mind. She tries talking to a nurse who responds with a scold, if you don't breastfeed, you'll regret missing out on that bond. Within Constellations, healthcare is foregrounded as a type of care which remains reliant on the exchange between the imported material goods such as medication, as well as between individuals, between the patient and provider, the body of the sick, and the institution charged with healing. In the disclosure, I'm confessing the worries I have about my body to a public figure. Pain becomes something I share, and giving away my suffering to empathy and schadenfreude. Here, Gleason's pain is treated like a formal conspiracy. The hospital is evacuated of its refuge, and her care for her newborn son appears in contradiction to her status as a disabled woman. The maternal behavior that is expected of her as a mother displaces her disability. There appears to be no room for these identities to coincide, and this, Gleason seems to suggest, is painful, dull, sore, hurting, aching, and heavy. The phenomenon of not being believed by various medical authorities being itself a type of pain is foregrounded in punishing, grueling, cruel, vicious, killing, unlistened to pain, in which she implicates the act of convincing a doctor of her pain is itself a form of violence, one which becomes necessary for her survival. The diagnosis and the agony are framed as at once inside and outside belief. This poem is much less tightly aligned to the left margin. Its prose cites verbatim speech and the political theorist Hannah Arendt. Rather than 7, it's 181 words across 14 lines. I promise I counted. Pain is about answering a question the body asks. It's shared to find a solution, but it's often met with doubt. Is it really that bad? Illness of any kind requires a private designation. It has become acceptable that many conditions are played out in waiting rooms, wards, and surgeries. Rendered public, making the experience of illness political, to borrow Hannah Arendt's assertion that any act undertaken in public is a political one. Within a condition of illness or pain, Gleason asserts that the body is made vulnerable as it is made public. This is not an inherent category. The diagnosis and the necessity of convincing are enacted within a construction of unequal social relations. To be wounded is not a disadvantage, but produces one in response to this sight, which is to say, it is not my body which included the world. The way power is structured produces bodies at its mercy. To perpetually ask for care in the same ways is what we might recognize as vulnerable. It is as much a state as it is contingent and responsive to the site of its production. If a sufficient register for pain is a lexicon outside didactic language, where does that leave us? Somewhere outside the weight of genre non-conforming prose, memoir, poetry. If the dominant rhetoric for pain is medical, then the vocabulary which defines the translation of the sensate into language requires a medical authority as a medium. The clinical space becomes a substrate through which the experience must pass. If we reconsider the value of the index and the scale, would we find more people? Would the community expand? Would the imagination of the unfathomable open to include those who are excluded from institutional vocabularies? In refiguring the register, might we conceptualize one that centers those in pain rather than those trying to eradicate it? In Melzak's article, the last line reads, "Humans are fortunate to have language to express their pain so that it can be known to others and we hope can be diminished by our growing armamentarium of therapies." I look up the word armamentarium. Its first taste is military. It seems too close to armament. According to the OED, it refers to the range of equipment, medicines, instruments, etc., and therapeutic techniques available to a medical practitioner in combating disease and ill health. But its etymology gives it away. Derived from an armory, the Latin term literally translated means little arsenal, from armamenta meaning implements and weapons. While medical interactions with pain have reduced quantitative scales, fixed registers, and other appraisers of pain to evaluate its severity, Melzak's closing line seems to say that pain, on some level, is a failure of management, that the arsenal does not yet contain the ultimate expression of weaponry, which is to say, when it comes to pain, we cannot kill it well enough. Held within both the index and the scale is the implicit assumption that in regards to pain, it's not real until it's been registered, either through observation and the visual register of the wound or through the medical vocabulary of the standardized scale. Within both of these inventories for pain, the measurement is incommensurate to the measure, as the scale is untethered from the body it's attached to. The failure to conduct the body through the statistic and therefore fail to manage pain appears consistently throughout the Undying, as Boyer elegantly illustrates pain as a system containing system, exposing the prosaic, legal, financial, and domestic structures through which pain passes in her life. By annotating the boundlessness of pain, Boyer foregrounds each system as inadequate, as unable to contain any kind of whole. In the Undying, every system appears as partial. The biometric calculation of her cancer pain via the scale, which rates it in intensity from 1 to 10, frequently appears as medicine's most fragmented type of code. Then they ask the question, rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. I try to answer, but the answer is always a numerical. Sensation is the enemy of quantification. There is no machine yet to which a nervous system can submit sensation to be transformed into a sufficiently descriptive measurement. Medicine hyper-responds to the body's unruly event of illness by transmuting it into data, relocating the nebulous and uncountability of illness into medicine's technologized math. She continues, stating, my name is Medical Information's Backup Plan. It is the punctum of every transmission of something to or from my body. I might sometimes remember who I am, but repetition is a method of desensitization. To rate yourself on the scale of 1 to 10. In cancer's medicalized abstraction, I become a barely, tertiary to the body sensation and medicine's informatic systems. Here, Boyer seems to invoke biometrics, as akin to Roland Barthes' understanding of language as a system of encoding, in which he states that language being a system, and the aim of the movement being romantically a direct subversion of codes, itself moreover illusory. A code cannot be destroyed, only played off. To the OED, a code is described as a system of signs or symbols, any system by which information or instructions are conveyed concisely, and a system used for economy or secrecy. Pain becomes the data her body emits as a code which cannot be destroyed, which in its quantification is transmuted into a system for management, insurance, recovery, and other kinds of economic power, all obscurities which commit agony into a type of secrecy. Even if we can manage the data, we cannot manage the code which the pain, the body, the self, the I is already enduring. In the Undying, pain is the code which cannot be destroyed or written out of the body, only made to seem illusory by the powers of white supremacists, capitalist patriarchy's ruinous carcinosphere, to quote Boyer. Therefore, the writing must play off pain as a direct subversion of this obscuring. There is no before and after code, only a desire to transmit sensation without secrecy in the attempt to access care. The pain scale as it operates within biomedical rhetoric seems self-alienating from within the capitalist medical universe in which all bodies must orbit around profit at all times. The scale is framed within the Undying and constellations as enacting a form of violence, as a mechanism of pain which corroborates in the creation of medical subjects through a process of quantification and subjugation. The person becomes the data they submit. We must become data. Without it, we won't qualify for care. Boyer recounts this through an instance after her double mastectomy. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read it all out, I'm afraid. This quote echoes the distinction that Gleason makes between a patient and a person, in which she argues, a patient is not a person. A patient is a medicalized version of the self. A patient is a hospitalized double of the body. Both Gleason and Boyer illustrate how the patient is constituted by reports, proof, evidence, and data, proposing that the essential information required by the hospital transactions relies on the patient repeatedly engaging in necessary acts of depersonalization. The process of writing, then, marks a commitment to re-inhabiting the body after it's been doubled away into obscurity and into abstract information. This can be seen perhaps most lucidly within Boyer's sardonic and flippant take on the seriousness of the pain scale, when she makes plans to sneak pamphlets with alternative vocabularies for pain into waiting rooms. These guides propose a surreal and absurd take of their own, consisting of fragments taken from the numbered poems of Emily Dickinson. When asked, how does your pain feel on a scale of 1 to 10? The answers become strange, darkly humorous, and aching replies that explode the scale entirely. They include 341, after great pain, a formal feeling comes. 477, no man can compass despair. 584, it ceased to hurt me. 599, there is a pain so utter. 650, pain has an element of blank. 761, from blank to blank. 1049, pain has but one acquaintance, and that is death. By proposing a disruption to the form and encoding of the pain through the scale, Gleason and Boyer advocate publicly for an intervention into the registration of pain's quantification. From pain, they have no distance. They are totally enmeshed in it, and so am I. So what am I supposed to do with the public? The only answer I can find simply says, don't withhold. I attended a talk by Fred Moten in which his son danced in the background of the Zoom as he talked about flatness, dimensionality, and sound. Moten asked, what if the symbol is a gatekeeper of the real? He was talking about tonality, painting, and music. When discussing the proof of dimensions within art and language, he turned the epistemological question on its head. Instead of proposing that the real is in doubt until it's seen, what if it's real till it's not observed? And I want to apply this to the statistically unobservable measurement of pain. Moten eloquently questioned the idea of measurement, investigating the expectation for information to arrive in discrete units, questioning formal presentations of data. He highlights the strangeness of the unit, of information arriving in calculable terms, recontextualizing them against a backdrop of rigorous artistic thought, in which an understanding of reality does not align itself to the laws of accounting or technological innovation. At the smallest scale of any computer, data is stored in bits. They're the smallest building block of storage, which can only log a 1 or a 0. Anything with two separate states can store 1 bit. Perhaps to transmute pain and the body into data is to compress it into a similarly diametrical structure of 1s and 0s, holding a positive or negative charge, or directed towards a northern or southern magnetic alignment. In conceptualizing the scale as a series of spatial relations, I think I'm suggesting that the binary and linear organization of data has an impact on the imaginative capacities of the pain index and the scale, that they're derived from the crisis of metric bombardment that characterizes the digital age, and are consequently only capable of two-dimensional representations of a much larger epistemological reality. I think what I'm trying to argue is that when given two-dimensional registers for pain, both Gleason and Boyer express the inability for those registers to hold a three-dimensional capacity. That is, if our reality is even three-dimensional at all. Superstring theory proposes we inhabit 10 dimensions at once. M theory suggests 11, while according to bosonic string theory, we simultaneously navigate 26 dimensions of space-time. Their work has turned to lyric modes of prose and poetry because we cannot contain a multidimensional conception of existence within ontologically prescriptive and compressive scales. They both recognize that the flattening of human experience becomes necessary, that to make pain measurable within a clinical setting, the metric is required to access medicine's promise of care in the face of capitalist priorities of insurance and other economies which rely on the body as a site of production and labor. In response, Constellations and the Undying propose pain to be an altitude and an amplitude, disrupting fixed registers and scales to demonstrate that even the encoding of pain itself might be nonlinear. As Fred Moten pointed out, you can only get from 0 to 1 by way of 2, thus exploding the rectilinear progression of the scale itself. By engaging with multiple genres, Gleason and Boyer utilize language as a technology to reflect the fullness of our bodies, as a means of annotating the curve and acknowledging the expansive dimensions of our experience, rather than trying to keep the score, store data, or quantify or calculate its mathematics. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. That was a really, I've just been furiously making notes. This is a really eloquent paper. Thank you for that. Let's move on to Geeta Raleigh. So Geeta Raleigh is a consultant breast cancer radiologist within the NHS and a published poet who also teaches creative writing at Imperial College's Centre for Culture, Languages and Communication. She holds an MA in creative writing from Birkbeck College, University London, and an MSc in medical humanities from King's College, London. All right, over to you, Geeta.
Okay, fantastic. I'll get started then. So I'm going to cover, actually, we were talking about this earlier, and although all three papers are on the same text, this is such a rich text that I really feel like we could talk about this for days. So I'm going to talk about the lyric essay and Anne Boyer's The Undying, but I'm going to make a case for actually reading The Undying as a lyric essay. And I'm going to start with a couple of quotes from poets that I love, which speak, I think, to this idea of the narrative in medicine and this yoking of these two terms, narrative and the medical humanities or the health humanities together. So Dionne Brand, a Canadian poet, said in her amazing hybrid work, The Blue Clark, story cannot account for existence. And in Anne Carthen's The Gender of Sound, which I'll refer to later, another salient quote is that she says, every sound we make is a bit of autobiography. So just to introduce very briefly the book, The Undying is billed as a meditation on modern illness in the UK edition, and it's a memoir of her treatment for breast cancer. When diagnosed, Boyer was a single mother, a poet teaching at Art College. She had an aggressive triple negative breast cancer, which means that she was negative for various receptors, which can lead to different forms of treatment. And this type of breast cancer has a poorer prognosis with a lower survival rate. As a poet and writer, the effects of her treatment, when she was unable to be as productive as she had been in the past, and she was most afraid, other than her fear of dying from her illness, of a loss of the work she might have produced. And in The Undying, she really interleaves her own experiences with historical writings on breast cancer, pain, and illness. And the text is really an assembly of these fragments of autobiography and feeling with extensive historical, scientific, literary, and artistic references. And notably, the American edition, which we saw on Kat's screen earlier, is subtitled The Undying, Pain, Vulnerability, Mortality, Art, Time, Dreams, Data, Exhaustion, Cancer and Care, which I think is a more accurate reflection of her book's many concerns. So I see The Undying as an extended lyric essay with a very real function of the lyricism in the text as reparative, something that makes whole what is irrevocably altered by the destructive effects of illness. And here I will draw parallels with the technique of ceramic repair known as kintsugi, a Japanese technique which translates as joining with gold. So the fragmented narrative is not a new thing, but it's relatively scarce, I think, in women's published accounts of breast cancer. In her paper, The Story of I, Illness and Narrative Identity, Shlomith Rimman-Kennan, who herself is a narratologist, describes how her sense of temporality, causality, and coherence, things that she has investigated in her work, are completely at odds with her own experience of illness, which she feels both as a rupture in temporality, where time both contracts and expands in strange ways, and also in her sense of continuity of self. And she asks, how is it that at a time when fragmentation is both prominent and valorized in postmodernist writing, illness narratives tend to preserve and even strive for coherence and continuity? Wouldn't narrative fragmentation be the most suitable form for the experience of disrupted narrative identity? Rimman-Kennan goes on to seek out the fragmented narrative, and she finds that to her, only they really lay bare the ill subject's vulnerability. In the Poetics of Fragmentation in contemporary British and American fiction, Guarneri and Dragg return to this idea of vulnerability, talking about how fragmentariness is commonly associated with vulnerability, a word whose etymology is significantly vulnus, the wound. And they go on to talk about how in our era of the vulnerable, works of fiction which relate personal and collective traumas both of which breast cancer is, of course, with a focus on this bodily frailty, should opt for the trope of vulnerability and for modes that include fragmentation and dislocation. The Undying is a really difficult work to categorize, and I was interested to read this review in American Micro Reviews by Annie Won of Boyer's previous hybrid work, Garments Against Women, where Annie Won says, "It's amusing to read the many previous reviews of Garments Against Women. Everyone wants to put Anne Boyer in a container. Is this lyric poetry, lyric prose, lyric essay, philosophical quotidian, creative political discourse, quintessential Kansas, techno, modern, contemporary?" And I had similar feelings when reading previous reviews of Boyer's work, but I would like to make a case for this to be seen as a lyric essay. So I'm just going to introduce the form. So the lyric essay, as with lyric poetry, uses artifices such as form, imagery, language, musicality to express embodied truths which may be resistant to other ways of telling. And the work of many poets such as Anne Carson, Claudia Rankine, and Maggie Nelson have been classified as lyric essays. It was first described in 1997 by D'Agata and Toole in the Seneca Review, who characterized it as follows. The lyric essay partakes of the poem in its density and shapeliness, its distillation of ideas and musicality of language. It partakes of the essay in its weight, in its overt desire to engage with facts, melding its allegiance to the actual with its passion for imaginative form. And they also go on to say that given its genre mingling, the lyric essay often accretes by fragments, taking shape mosaically, its import visible only when one stands back and sees it whole. The stories it tells may be no more than metaphors or storyless. It may spiral in on itself, circling the core of a single image or idea without climax, without a paraphrasable theme. And I would also make a case for the strength of the lyric I, the first person expressed often in the lyric essay and lyric poetry, and how this means that we may see this form as somewhat in continuity with a long history of really kind of marginalized women's writing, confessional, intimate forms such as the letter and diary. So I'll return to the lyricism, but I want to talk a little bit about form. Something which Boyer actually refers to repeatedly in her text, in her struggle to put this kind of nebulous experience of illness into a form. So the text is divided into chapters, which are named, but within these chapters, there are also smaller numerically demarcated sections and even further fragmentation, which is marked out merely by white space and blank pages within the text. Boyer also explicitly sets out her resistance to telling her story according to the standard illness memoir narrative. I do not want to tell the story of cancer in the way I have been taught to tell it. The way I have been taught to tell the story is a person would be diagnosed, treated, either live or die. If she lives, she will be heroic. If she dies, she will be a plot point. The Undying encompasses Boyer's lived experience of treatment with her dreams and reverie, the internet outpourings of breast cancer support groups, the work of other writers such as Sontag and Wolf, as well as her anger at disparities in cancer survival and the profit-based US healthcare system. Boyer knows that disease is never neutral, treatment never not ideological, and mortality never without its politics. Although The Undying is a fragmented text, each named chapter does progress in a more or less temporal sequence through the author's neoadjuvant chemotherapy, her mastectomy and reconstruction, and eventual recovery. And Boyer throughout draws parallels between her own experience and the writings of a 2nd century Greek orator, Elias Aristides, who wrote in his sacred tales of his visits to the temple of the Greek god of healing, Asclepius. Aristides suffered from chronic illnesses and lived for years in the temple, where, following purges and fasting, he would enter the inner sanctum to sleep among the other incubants, awaiting the appearance of the healing god in his dreams. And the following morning, the incubants would relate their dreams to the priests of the temple, who would prescribe their treatments accordingly. Boyer compares this inner sanctum of dreaming with the endless data and digressions of the internet, where she feels compelled to roam night after night. And she likens the temple handmaidens to the hospital nurses who are also women. And so the function of the sacred snakes who slithered freely over the grounds of the temple remains mysterious to us now. Her narrative has a meandering quality which mimics a snake's motion. And the US cover even uses the image of the snake-entwined rod of Asclepius the healer, which is a symbol of many medical organizations today, replacing the rod with a syringe. In Jane Allison's book, Meander, Spiral, Explode, she dissects narrative patterns in fiction outside the standard arc, and she defines a meandering narrative as one of repeated digressions and references Italo Calvino's 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, where Italo Calvino says, that digression is a strategy for putting off the ending, a multiplying of time within the work, a perpetual invasion or flight. Flight from what? From death, of course. And Boyer herself says at the end of one passage, I decide the question posed by this book is, are you going to be the snake or are you going to be the snake's cast off skin? And her work was assembled, of course, from notes, diary entries, emails, even tweets that she made during her treatment, together with her later reflections. At the time of these writings, she didn't actually know if she would survive the illness she was documenting. The detachment, rupture, fragmentation, and repetitions within the Undying reflect her precarity, both in socioeconomic position and as survivor of an aggressive breast cancer. And in an interview on the Poetry Foundation website, she talks about the title of her book and says, I had and have an ambivalent relationship to the term survivor, but to be among the undying, not just someone in its process, is to recognize that all that remains is a mix of death and life, and some live and some die, but parts of all of us remain as other parts are lost. Her book does not hide the scars created by her illness, but it displays them. The lyrical elements in her text function as a gold joining the cracks seen in the Japanese art of kintsugi, which involves reassembling parts of broken ceramic, joining the fragments together with a lacquer mixed with gold or silver powder. This leaves a fault line strong enough that the item is usable, but the resulting gold or silver veins allow the process of breakage and repair and reconstitution to remain as part of the object's history. As a poet, Boyer struggles with how to use her suffering in the service of art without turning it into a product. And she references Aristides' own difficulty in expressing how it feels to write about illness while experiencing the illness, which he says seemed to be the same as if he should swim underwater through every sea and be compelled to render an account of this. How many waves I encountered, how I found the sea at each of them, and what it was that saved me. And as she says here, her cancer was not just her sensory, the set of sensations she experienced, nor lessons in interpretation, nor an art problem, but to her, it was also all of these things. And she discusses how a friend told her that it was clear that when she was at her absolute lowest, what she needed really was art, was aesthetic extremity, to daydream of coffins filled with embalming honey, speculative religions, write polemics, conceive of a brand new version of the funerary, and then talk about the things we should take with us to the afterworld, which she also tried to reinvent. So it's clear that this escape and this aesthetic extremity was a survival mechanism for her. Because her style tends towards the prose poem rather than formal stanzas or lineation, these flights within lyricism are truly integrated within her text. And she references the first half of this famous Woolf quote from her essay on being ill. To look at these things, the possibility of death, would need the courage of a lion tamer, a robust philosophy, a reason rooted in the bowels of the earth. Short of these, this monster, the body, this miracle, its pain will soon make us taper into mysticism or rise with rapid beats of the wings into the raptures of transcendentalism, something which Woolf was rather scathing about. But Boyer, on the other hand, does not resist these flights. Here she's in a cardiology ward where they're investigating whether the chemotherapy she had has caused irreversible damage to her heart. And she talks of attaching her thoughts, I won't read the whole quote for it in the interest of time, to a large white goose. So segueing beautifully from her own feelings of pain, isolation, and fear into metaphor. And she says of her book, "This is a treatise on pain, made of notes and starts, ephemeral sensations, monument of an ephemeralist half literature." The book is often very funny. Her subtitles for it include "Mutilated Body as Eco-Poetic," "Unbearable Pain as Kantian Critique," my favorite, "Onco-Surrealism," "Suture as Epic Theory," "The Somopathetic Fallacy of Spring." So, Asquinarian drag state. In fragmented writing, the seams between the numerous scraps or shards of which the text is interwoven are deliberately exposed rather than concealed. And as readers, we must work with Boyer to join these fragments together, actively engage in what she terms here a minor form of reparative magic. And as she says in her epilogue, this is why she felt her book had to exist. The artist and writer Helene Guggenheim has created a project, I won't read it in French, but in English, the translation is "My scars, of them I am fully woven," where she applies gold leaf to the healed mastectomy scars of participants in a piece of performance art, and afterwards peels away the gold and retains it in a vial, which is inscribed with the participant's name and the date of the performance. And as medicine anonymizes and depersonalizes the body, turning our experience into data, Boyer's lyrical assembly of autobiography, poetic flight, literary, artistic, and feminist references refashions her experience of illness into art. Her lyrical voice becomes a gold, not merely joining the cracks of her narrative, but also highlighting each fragment as a feature. So as we've already seen from Kat's beautiful presentation, I think the lyric essay, with its fragmentation, gaps, and silences, its differing modes, its intertextuality, would seem an ideal vessel to hold the illness narrative, the body's disobedient breaking apart and reconstitution, both in illness and more generally, for our bodies are as unstable and shifting as the world and our relationships within that world. Thank you.
Thank you, Keita. That was a really beautiful paper, and really appreciated all of the images that you used as well. That was brilliant. I'm sure everyone will have lots of questions later. We'll move on to our final speaker of this panel, so Anne Mulhall. So, oh gosh, I've lost my paper now. There we go. So Anne Mulhall is a Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellow in comparative literature at Trinity College Dublin. She has previously held a postdoctoral position at the Pembroke Centre for Teaching and Research on Women at Brown University, a research fellowship at the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing at the IMLR, and has taught for 3 years at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of Tyumen, Russia. I should have asked how to pronounce that at the beginning, apologies. She broadly researches the intersections of the contemporary literature and philosophy of work with radical thought across Europe, the US, and Russia. Her manuscript on the French philosophical collective Tiquin is currently being revised for publication. She is also preparing a manuscript on the temporalities of the workplace between the financial crisis of 2008 and the contemporary COVID crisis. So I'll hand over to Anne now.
Thank you. Just to give a description of myself, I suppose I'm a white Irish woman in her 30s. I've badly chosen a maroon top against a red background, so probably hard to see in the best of lights. So I'm going to start now with a paper on Anne Boyer. So over the past 15 years, Anne Boyer has published a series of poems detailing the most intimate, mundane aspects of her life in Kansas, focusing on gender, production, and work. Her poems usually foreground precarity, sex, reproduction, child rearing, consumption, exhaustion, writing, and the refusal of writing. So her most recent collection is The Undying, and it's a meditation on her own experience of breast cancer, as we know, that searches for the social meaning of the illness in contemporary culture. And I think what the other guys have mentioned as well is that the collection imagines this kind of porous border between living and dying, something that Boyer sees as counter to an approach in modernity that holds life and death as binary opposites. And she draws on work of antecedents like Kathy Acker, Eve Kafofsky-Sedgwick, and Rachel Carson, and all of these people who kind of reflected on their own experiences of breast cancer while posing these larger critical questions about how the disease is viewed and constructed within, I suppose, capitalistic societies. So Boyer's adding to this critical tradition. She's particularly picking up on how the neoliberal worldview has recuperated narratives of breast cancer to its own ends. And this is kind of mostly through the pink ribbon approach that she often describes. So really at the heart of this collection is a subject conditioned by her own vulnerability. We kind of spoke about that before, but it's something that she kind of engenders, essentializes, ignores, despises, but she really recuperates this kind of sense of vulnerability. So I want to kind of read her work alongside some contemporary political theory engaged with questions of vulnerability, such as work by the Italian philosopher Adriana Cavarero. And I think this can kind of maybe enhance our understanding of questions of vulnerability, potentiality and actuality around narratives of women's illness. So I hope we can kind of complicate some categories, with implications for feminist politics, such as vulnerability, inclination, and even lack. So inclination has really emerged as a way of rethinking contemporary politics from a feminist perspective. And this is really brought to the fore by the Italian philosopher Adriana Cavarero. So she's kind of challenging a phallocratic norm in Western discourse. She's trying to overturn embedded associations between uprightness, erectness, morality, and clear purpose. In a kind of alternative geometric vision, Cavarero promotes what she calls an ontology of the vulnerable. And she kind of uses the maternal imagery of the Virgin and Child, urging us to understand its role outside of Christian iconography. And she's kind of setting it in opposition to the subject of rectitude, okay, so which has existed as kind of a paradigm in the popular political imagination for centuries. So she's saying this kind of maternal duo offers an alternative model of morality against the upright man of modern philosophy who conforms to the vertical axis. The Virgin and Child kind of offer a powerful antithetical model of vulnerable subjectivity. And other critics like Bonnie Honig and Claire Woodford and people have really run with this and shown how it can be used for contemporary feminist political intention. We're seeing a lot about vulnerability in philosophy at the moment. People like Judith Butler and Zainab Gambetti have paired these concepts, exactly vulnerability and resistance, together, while Anu Koivin and others have offered a kind of really particularly inclusive appraisal of the many philosophical and sociological approaches to vulnerability as a political tool. So I think Boyer kind of works within this tradition as well. So in my previous work, sorry, I'm a bit breathless, I'm 38 weeks pregnant, so just forgive me. In my previous work on Boyer's earlier collections, I've suggested that Boyer too often thinks about this question of posture and its political implications. Other engagement with Boyer's work have also foregrounded vulnerability as a form of political action. So the critic Walt Hunter, for example, has suggested reading an earlier poem of Boyer's, The Animal Model of Inescapable Shock, which comes in her 2015 collection, Garments Against Women. It is precisely vulnerability that emerges in her poetry as a form of politics in its own right. I also read Boyer's poems in Garments Against Women as part of a particular constellation of literary work that has explored exhaustion and vulnerability, both collective and individual, as a form of agency against the declining social organization of advanced capitalism. So in these poems in Garments Against Women, I would argue that Boyer kind of displays a skepticism about any potential to organize in any sort of traditionally revolutionary political way. And many of these other works I've worked on before also kind of feature subjects racked by sickness and dejection. Now, the question of vulnerability, posture and inclination, and the political elements of these become even more pronounced in The Undying, where Boyer discusses her own physical posture and positioning, and its absolute vulnerability in the face of her diagnosis. So she finds herself in positions that she must incline towards others, and how she's unable to remain upright and participate in a world that forces her to continue to participate throughout her illness. She writes about her situation as a single parent and how she must accept the care of her friends. She describes having to go and teach in her job 10 days after leaving hospital for a double mastectomy, because she's no choice without social protection. So she uses her own vulnerability as a single parent in a precarious work situation and financial situation to highlight the situation of many women who suffer from breast cancer and who find themselves up against the invulnerability of a heavily ideological class, gendered and racialized system that treats them unequally. So she writes that breast cancer patients who live in poorer neighborhoods have a lower survival rate at every stage of diagnosis. Unmarried breast cancer patients who live in poor neighborhoods have the lowest survival rate of all. She directly addresses the question of posture and of horizontality against verticality throughout the text, and what the difference between the two might mean for life, for thoughts, for feelings, emotions, and for politics. She talks about the piece of furniture that is the bed, that there's no more, quote, tragic piece of furniture than a bed, how it falls so quickly from the place we make love to the place we might die in. She writes, in vertical life, when you are well and mostly walking around, pretending to be, and the top of your head is the space that the heavens touch. And mostly during the night, during dreams, that imagining becomes temporarily expansive and the air spreads over you, or at least this was in those days, the magic of theory I conjured in bed to explain the relationship of posture to thought. Boyer develops the differences between the vertical and the horizontal to suggest something else, the sick person's abilities to go beyond the normal realm of human experience and imagination. She says, the ill person in pain, in order to escape it, can sprint away from the pain husk of the failing body and think themselves into a range beyond range. But what are the links between uprightness and verticality with the ideology of resilience and invulnerability, as underscored in the kind of pink ribbon narratives of breast cancer? And how does it come across in The Undying? Boyer finds in her own sickness and forced horizontality something powerful that can be an antidote to the pink-washed landscape of breast cancer, where the notions of resilience, a byword for compliance with contemporary neoliberal notions of flexibility, and invulnerability have become the master narratives that dominate kind of any interactions with it in the kind of common narrative. To tell the story of one's own breast cancer is to tell the story of surviving, she says, by neoliberal self-management. The narrative, she says, of the atomized individual done right, self-examined and mammogrammed, of disease cured with compliance, 5K runs, organic green smoothies, and positive thought. And she describes the drama of the individual battle with cancer played out against the backdrop of society. Elsewhere, she writes that every patient in this worldview must be a celebrity survivor, and women must become productively exposed for the gains of ideology. And they must appear, she suggests, before, during, and after cancer treatment as feisty, sexy, thinking, snarky women. So in opposition to this kind of forced resilience and the awareness culture that profits off the sick, Boyer suggests an alternative political stance of, quote, taking the form of background noise, wearing a wig and refusing legibility's grosser narrative. In this, as in all of her work, Boyer refuses the common narrative of transparency, positivity, and self-management normally associated with the contemporary neoliberal condition, and thus again embraces another feminist legacy of vulnerability and inclination that we see discussed in a work like Cavarero's. So speaking about her cancer from this position of vulnerability also allows her to attempt to honestly express herself about the physical pain she feels. We've talked quite a bit about this already, but she feels that this kind of idea of pain is underexposed in common narratives of breast cancer survival, and underdeveloped generally in any philosophy of suffering. So within the kind of current awareness culture, instead of being allowed to communicate about their pain, she suggests, people with breast cancer are supposed to be ourselves as we were before, but also better and stronger. Sufferers and survivors are to donate their courage to everyone and to dance toward their mastectomies. In this narrative, the reality of pain and suffering undergone by women gets glossed over. The day-to-day phenomenological reality of the breast cancer sufferer is left unexpressed. And in general, within contemporary thought, she has this kind of argument that within even philosophy and creative writing, pain is considered ineffable and therefore inexpressible within language. And she really disagrees with this. A widely held notion she suggests is that about pain is that it seems to destroy language. But she says, no, look, it doesn't destroy language. It just changes it. So in other words, finding ways to express pain is something that makes language anew. For Boyer, pain can be expressible. It should not have to be something that is indescribable. She shares what she describes as pain's naked grammar, something which on the face of it looks like this kind of inchoate diary entry, but on close inspection shows how in its very form, how pain can write and communicate, and how it's mediated by time and space. And it kind of exists as this phenomenological account of her current somatic condition. Philosophy in general, though, she says, fails in its task to communicate pain, especially phenomenology. And, you know, phenomenology is supposed to be kind of this, like, we think about structures of consciousness from the first person point of view. But Boyer says it falls short with it. It falls short with this idea. She says there's a rumor that any consideration of pain nests under phenomenology, but phenomenology mostly stops at a modest sliver of available pain and declares it as a universal whole. So my body becomes the body. And we only have to think of, you know, some of the great works in philosophy of pain, like even Elaine Scarry, where we're thinking about the body in pain. Okay, so it's kind of a universalization of pain rather than anything personal. Boyer says that instead she wants to write about pain without any philosophy. I want to describe an education in pain and pain's educational uses, or political uses, sorry. So she's kind of hankering after a more personalized account that can also have a universal political effect. She wants kind of both things here. But if an overly universalist philosophy fails the political test of granting a voice to personal pain, for Boyer, poetry and other forms of creative writing at least attempt to arise to the challenge. So Boyer kind of more relies on accounts of pain, such as John Donne's sickbed poetry, or Fanny Burney's account of the pain of her own unanesthetized mastectomy. But Boyer really has to work through a lot of antecedents to find out how to give voice to her pain and her experiences of cancer through language. Some writers, she suggests, depersonalize their experience. Okay, they find it hard to make the definitive link between I or my and cancer, and they kind of refuse to speak in a personal way. So she's really good at recognizing this kind of gulf in cancer writing between the personal and the universal, and she kind of consistently returns to this in her work. So she's talking about Susan Sontag, who Boyer tells us had kind of made herself write aphoristically about cancer, to think about illness as metaphor, which is the title of her book. So she recognizes this kind of a personal reaction rather than a political decision. And she's all the time trying to negotiate in which way will she herself publish about her own experience with the most aggressive form of breast cancer, triple negative. So she's engaging with all these writers. Sontag's kind of personalized anti-personal account, the American poet Audre Lorde's highly political, absolute identification with her illness that infuses her writing with a deeply political feminist and anti-racist flavour, and the Australian feminist Kathy Acker's straightforward kind of personal account. So Boyer works her way through all of these kind of spectrum of approaches, recognizing the worth in all of these approaches. So in their diversity, they become examples of how she herself might circumvent the current market ideological approach. And she does choose kind of a very personal engagement with her own pain. So over and over, and it really reaches this crescendo toward the end of the text, she attempts to find ways of describing her own pain. We've had really good interrogations of this from our previous speakers. But it's not as something that's universal, but it's open to universal recognition by others. I think that's important to kind of point out. She chooses her very own personalized pain in the hope that this admission might have a larger political value. It's a non-analogical, non-metaphorical approach to the topic, which is kind of strange, I suppose, for a poet in the first place, but it's also a change from her previous writing. In Garments Against Women from 2015, with its concerns about writing and the refusal to write, she deploys the homology of sewing and dressmaking. So she's really kind of moving into the realm of homology, of analogy, of metaphor there. So she can think of writing in terms of labor, okay? Where writing and the refusal of writing kind of represent paradoxes of creative work and modernity. And she's really aware in that collection, Garments Against Women, about how kind of capitalist modernity, I suppose, has come to colonize all facets of existence, even the creative. Okay, so she's really wary about talking about writing, not in a kind of metaphorical way. And this came up with our last speaker as well. Though she writes about her pain in this collection, she's very reluctant to do so, because she says, look, there's this kind of fear of capitalizing on it, or it being recuperated by some other agent. So she said, I'd rather write about anything else, not for fear of the pain, examining the pain, but also for fear of turning the pain into a product. She fears that even if she rejects openly what she calls capitalism's incredible machine of profit, the spectacle of contemporary ontological imagery and its kind of tendency to obliterate the reality of sufferers' lives, and to create an ideologically specific and historically contingent image of the cancer survivor will kind of, infect what she's doing as well. She might still end up kind of upholding a narrative of cancer and pain that capitalizes upon it. Because, as we're going to know from Guy Debord and others, there's no way out of this kind of recuperation effect. So she kind of longs for a bygone era before cancer was kind of, when it was free from this kind of ideological baggage. I don't know how much time I've left. I don't want to go over too far. So I was going to talk a little bit about death and Catherine Malibu, but I think I'll skip that. So just to kind of end here, so I just wanted, I suppose, the paper to kind of suggest in an early version how, against the arguably universalizing ideologies of contemporary oncological imagery, Boyer's work offers this kind of uniquely feminist phenomenological perspective, one that finds its voice through themes of vulnerability, pain, and potential. In this sense, the collection, The Undying, allows us to consider not only what is possible for sufferers to do under contemporary neoliberal conditions, but also what it is possible not to do and how to recognize this. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne, for that paper. That was brilliant and crossed over, I think, really well with the other two papers too. So, oh yeah, you're all on camera. That's great. So we have now 25 minutes or so. You can go a little bit over as well if you like, for questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, which I believe is found if you, let me double check that. If you kind of hover over your name, you should be able to raise hand. Sorry, if you click on participants, you should be able to raise your hand through there. So does anybody have any questions, or the speakers maybe have any questions for each other? If not, I can kick off with a question. So I have questions for all of you. I'll start with Kat just because, you know, it's chronological. I was interested in what you're saying at the end of your paper about language as a technology, and you're using quite sort of technical, well, I don't know, technical for me at least, language of like encoding pain, and you're talking about like altitude and amplitude. And I was just wondering kind of if you could expand a bit more on this idea of language as a technology, because that really kind of struck with me as a phrase that you said at the end, and what you kind of mean by that, and how that relates to Boyer, Gleason, and what like technology kind of specifically, language as technology specifically does, more so than like, I don't know, language as, I don't know, embodied, or language as like, you know, poetics, all of these other kind of turns of phrase that I'm sure we've heard, you know, doing trauma studies and literary theory and things like that. So yeah, what does language as a technology mean for you, essentially?
Thank you. That's a really, really interesting question. I think what I'm trying to get at, and Geeta, absolutely please feel free to jump in here, is that what I think I'm trying to kind of recognize is that language is a technology rather, or I guess what I'm trying to say is like language as a system. So in the same way that we recognize healthcare systems, or in kind of what I'm referencing at the end, kind of like technological and almost like informatic systems, or in some ways like mathematical or physical systems, like language is the way in which we still communicate them. We still have to use language in order to kind of enunciate or articulate those like particular encodings of thought through which we move as a reality. Please tell me if this doesn't quite make sense. This is still, I'm like still part of kind of working on this chapter of my thesis. But what I think I'm trying to pull out of both Gleason and Boyer is that they're using kind of poetic language, or the kind of formal possibilities of poetics, in order to kind of disrupt almost the kind of transparency with which we assume those systems operate. And it was really interesting that like we brought up the lyric essay, and there's this one particular quote by, I think it's Plutarch, that like springs to mind, was that an essay becomes lyric is an essay that's killed itself. And he talks about like a run-on line can seem like less a sloppy piece of grammar than a desperate act to stay alive, and the ways in which kind of poetic, almost like analogy, because I'm never quite sure what prose poetry, like the rules for kind of genre get really fuzzy whenever we kind of talk about lyric essays. And it's like, I think we both touched on this, like the indeterminacy of form, like everyone's kind of trying to slot it into slightly different categories, because it is almost that expansive. We're never quite sure like where to put it, because it's kind of so snake-like and so curvaceous in some ways. Like it's very discursive. So I think when I say like language as a technology, to kind of reflect the fullness of our bodies, I'm trying to think about language as almost like an inhabitation, instead of kind of looking at like the inhospitality of like either economic or like institutional systems, like creating one that does actually allow for kind of disabled flourishing, or kind of ill flourishing, or ways in which the language can kind of hold or kind of recuperate in more generous ways, rather than ones that are kind of deemed as exploitative under neoliberal capitalism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think fascinating, really interesting, Kat. And also, I mean, I suppose all of these books and all of these texts that we've mentioned today really have this kind of project, although it's not defined in the language, but they're kind of a counter, I guess, or counteracting the sort of use as language as technology by medicine, and which includes, you know, the sort of the capitalist sort of outreaches of medicine and drug companies and big pharma and, you know, medical institutions, in that, you know, we capture sort of, you know, speaking as a doctor, there's some statistic that at medical school, I think in their first year, students learn 10,000 new words or something ridiculous, like more than you would have thought is possible. And so medicine is already using language as a technology to kind of capture and lay claim over things. And I suppose these works in their poetics are kind of counteracting that by using their own discursive, unruly, undefined kind of, manners of sort of disrupting that use of language as technology, so making language their own technology in a way. So I love that. That's really interesting. I'd love to read your dissertation when it's done.
Yeah, it's hard even in Boyer's own reaction to her own work, or how she's speaking about language, about cancer, about pain. I mean, she's really and this is what's hard to do when you're speaking about her work as well, is to not kind of ascribe a use value to it. She's doing something productive with it to kind of transmit this new language of pain, or to enable us to try and come to some political understanding of pain. But it's very hard to even find the vocabulary to describe what she's doing without kind of putting it into a productive sense as well. Is like that something is happening here that's anti-capitalistic or anti kind of I suppose neoliberal worldview, or anti sort of accepted oncological discourse. But it's very hard to not kind of productivize that as well, or technologize that even in some respects. So it's an interesting question.
Do we have any other questions maybe? I'm trying to see if there are any in the chat or...
Just returning to your last point, Anne, it's interesting, isn't it? Because of her, all through her text, there is this anxiety about turning her suffering into a product, into this book, that you almost worry, in the field of academia, are we kind of, reproducing this kind of this paradigm? I mean, are there ways that we can learn from her experience and use her experience productively without making her a product? I don't know. It's just a question that occurred to me when I was working on my dissertation and my talk.
Absolutely, and that's what she seems to be so aware of as well when she's talking about all of these other kind of antecedents. I mean, how to not deploy them in a certain way that negates their own particular project, or uses them in kind of some new way. So you always feel that tension that she's kind of caught in this trap with it. I'm not sure that she even leaves that behind towards the end. I mean, she goes straight into the kind of death conversation at the very end, and you wonder, is that kind of a way of sloughing this off or something? I don't know.
I think she does that really interestingly in kind of relation to like environmental and ecological concerns, because I know there's that one point in the book where she kind of traces the production of all her kind of chemo drugs and like the absolute kind of environmental destruction that has. I think she says like it would take me, I think it's a very, very large number, like something like 10,000 books to even be able to begin to offset the kind of the damage that I've made, and yet I still want to survive. And there's this like absolute tension between her wanting to write, wanting to not write, wanting to survive, and at the same time holding the kind of space open for how much her body will take up in surviving. And I don't know if she ever necessarily finds an answer to that. And I think I like that in some ways. Like it's a little bit like what you were saying about the gaps in the fragment, kind of in the remnants that are left over out of kind of her survival. You're left to kind of fill in the spaces. Like in reading it, you then become complicit in that awareness. And so now the text becomes something that is shared. That discomfort, that anxiety becomes something that I think is like communicated across another kind of boundary.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any questions from any of the audience there? Or you can feel free just to, put it in the chat. I can read it out for you, or you can raise your hand. No. Otherwise, I can ask another question. I was really interested and really appreciated the images in your paper, Geeta, of the like reconstituted kind of ceramics or pottery, essentially, with the gold in it, and it, obviously I don't know that much about it, but I can imagine it's that combination of like use, purpose, as well, and continued life, as well as like aesthetically kind of pleasing with the gold in it as well. And obviously you can draw out lots of like connotations of like the beauty of the reconstitution and taking the fragments and like giving them like new life and new purpose. And I was just wondering, I was just thinking, and I don't know whether I'm just like being like too arts and humanities and like reading too much into this, but after Anne's paper, it struck me the that idea of this idea of being kind of like essential, like usefulness, constant usefulness and optimization, and like the wellness industry that you were mentioning, Anne, and that idea of like it's kind of wrapped up in a lot of like obviously like class, like heteronormative beauty standards, and it's this kind of like the beautiful suffer in a way, and it's part of that kind of thing. And I was just wondering if there's a tension in the kind of the Japanese ceramics thing as well, that idea of like beauty, purpose, use, re-optimizing. Obviously I'm not like completely dissing the pottery because I think it is beautiful and it's lovely, but I'm just wondering if there's a tension there in that kind of like, I don't know, trying to like
analogy,
optimize something for beauty, rather than maybe, I know I don't want to use like pejorative terms, but I know, but like sitting in kind of like, abjectness or sitting in ugliness, like can also be a kind of like productive, vibrant thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think sitting in pieces is kind of really probably a better analogy to how a lot of people feel when they're going through this. And I think my perspective on it, I suppose, was a little bit from a medical perspective, in that we talk a lot in breast cancer about this idea of the survivor and survivorship. I mean, there are whole kind of follow-up studies and whole kind of, things looking on the medical side about, this idea of survivorship, which does make it sound like this kind of army of women, marching forth, being survivors. And I quite liked the idea that actually, it's still a fragile, breakable thing. It's just about being held together and assembled, but there's a tension between it being held together and breaking apart that we can see in those images, which I think is a more accurate reflection than the medical terminology we frequently use for whatever reason, which is, a breast cancer survivor, which I think was originally started because, people didn't want to be labeled a victim of breast cancer, which horrifyingly was probably more the case back in the sort of 70s and 80s, but now that kind of emphasis on survivorship and strength is something I think that she's definitely working against. I mean, on beauty and aesthetics, there's a really bizarre and fascinating passage where she actually talks about this weird kind of sexual subculture, which kind of, there's like these chat groups where men fantasize about beautiful young women and them having breast cancer, which is really bizarre. And I would never have imagined that such a thing exists. So I think you're absolutely right that we need to be very careful and wary of using sort of analogies that prioritize appearance and beauty especially when dealing with a disease like breast cancer. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, this is not really a question but a comment, but it kind of struck me the kind of, I imagine there's still like a lot of pressure and desire, obviously, but also pressure to have like I don't know what you call it, reconstitutive surgery after mastectomy or double mastectomy, and how that is actually quite expensive. It's just like it's not available to everybody, so the aesthetics
I mean, it is. The weird thing is it is available to everybody and it's prioritized over, as she says in the States, her insurance will cover her reconstruction, but it won't cover somebody to drive her home and cook her a meal and care for her when she's kind of recovering from this. Yeah, it's really very major surgery. So, the insurance is quite happy to go, women should have 2 boobs. That's what a male, hetero patriarchal kind of, that we'll pay for that. We're definitely not going to pay for someone to come over and like clean your house and cook for you, because that's not our problem. So it's really bizarre that, the whole thing is structured in this way. And there's been lots of other sort of artistic interactions with women who have had their mastectomy site tattooed beautifully rather than having reconstruction, and made that a choice. There's a photographer whose name I can't remember, who's done a whole study of these women. But it seems like it's one of these illnesses where we cannot separate out the asceticism, of our approach to it with our, our whole ideas about femininity and the breast and all its kind of cultural overtones. So I absolutely agree that, we need to be very, very careful. And I'm not, by any means saying that this is an analogy that makes sense to anyone, perhaps other than myself. So.
Yeah, I think it's important you mentioned that aspect of the book, because I find that absolutely shocking, in terms of social protection in the US, that, there is this, money put aside for reconstruction, but yet, there isn't, and even for her own care, like she's finding it, or her own, oncological care, like she's finding it hard to actually meet the monetary requirements for it, and then for aftercare and everything. But yet this other aspect of it, which you said is that the aestheticized version of it is covered. So yeah, I find that strange. I mean, I don't know how it is in the UK or in Europe, but it certainly speaks to something in contemporary society, or I don't know whether it's contemporary US society or in general.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, likewise, anyone who wants reconstruction is offered reconstruction. But the wider social care network, I think, is equally lacking, really, in terms of, and she talks a little bit about this pressure to kind of get everything done in the least time possible. Cancer operations regularly take place in a day, and you're sent home the same day sometimes. And there is this complete lack of, particularly in her position as a single mother with no family, there's a wider thing here, as you talk about, and in that somebody is meant to pick up these pieces of caring, and that somebody is usually a woman. And if it's a woman who is the one who picks up the pieces who's sick, there's almost no provision for that in any, sort of Western society, which I thought was really shocking and interesting.
We've got a question in the chat here from Linda saying, thanks so much, great presentations. With what you're saying about the resistance to comply with the writing as a product, do you know how she responded to the Pulitzer Prize Award? That's in reference to Anne Boyer winning, is it non-fiction last year, I think, 2020? No, I don't know if all of you want to comment on that.
I'm afraid I don't actually know the answer to that. I know she accepted it. But I think there's kind of a wider question there about like the way in which the publishing industry is run, but I know that's probably slightly tangential to this like very kind of important discussion on kind of like oncological and epistemological thought. So we can talk about it, but I know that's very much side to medical humanities.
Yeah. I'm afraid I don't know either. I hope she celebrated. I hope she's taking full advantage of the fact that, she has created something very unique, I felt, on reading it, both from my perspective as a doctor who deals with breast cancer patients and as a medical humanities scholar. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it is an interesting question in terms of this kind of thinking about productivity and use value and all of these different things, and kind of this reward. Yeah, I don't know her exact reaction to it, but I know, I mean, she's had kind of so much success in recent years that she's kind of only kind of experienced maybe in the past 3 or 4 years with, she's had the stints in Cambridge and Yale and all of these different places. So I presume that will always be a tension in her work. I mean, she openly negotiates this problem over and over and over, whether it's talking about, the productive or the fear of productivizing pain, or this question about writing that really kind of comes across in Garments Against Women. She's the romance of Happy Workers years ago, where she's addressing some of these questions as well. So I think, there's always kind of going to be that tension, no matter how successful she is in this. And I think that's very recognizable in all of her endeavors. And I think, you know, it gets picked up by critics a lot. So I don't really know the answer to that question, but it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think it's like that wider question of like how on earth you live as a poet and as a writer and like as an academic, like how you make enough money to live. Because she's always talking about like you know, the question of like maternity and like disability and money and how they all kind of run counter to kind of capitalist production. But at the end of the day, she still needs to live. She still needs to provide for her daughter. She still needs to kind of like provide for herself. So like how one goes about doing that without just relying on the body as like a site of kind of productive value is like one of those things that I know I have no answers to. And I didn't really like, I don't think that The Undying gives any easy answers to that either.
This is just like a very like side comment, but her Instagram account is quite, I'm sure you'll follow, I've seen it, her Instagram I can't speak today. Instagram account is quite good for following like her like immediate kind of like thoughts on, like she posts a lot about like money and moving costs as well. Funny, I've just had an email from one of the participants in the conference about moving costs and managing the conference. So it's all kind of like all these issues of like academia and surviving are kind of in my mind at the moment. Anywho, we've got a question in the chat from Leah. This could potentially be our last question because it's, you know, nearly 11, but we can always go a little bit over because our next panels don't start until next set of panels don't start until 11:15 BST. Anyway, Leah's question. So, such an interesting panel. I would like to hear more about the critique of phenomenology in Boyer's work. Do you think this runs against the grain of much autopathography / illness writing? I think this is more to Anne, I think.
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, she comes up with this idea, you know, that phenomenology isn't actually addressing the question of pain. And of course, we turn to phenomenology in philosophy because we want to kind of find some answers about how the self, you know, generates, I don't know, feelings or affect or in the face of something that's in front of it. And I think that she is not, I mean, I think she's kind of seems to be critiquing, you know, phenomenology with a capital P as a subject that is not doing the job it's meant to be doing. Because I would see her as kind of a phenomenological writer. I mean, I've argued that in the past with some of her other work, that she's, you know, providing us with this feminist phenomenology. But, you know, I think she's kind of sort of overstating this, you know, at the expense of phenomenology in general. How does it, you're talking about autopathological writing and illness narratives. I mean, I think that what she's trying to do is show us a way to do this, is kind of show us this phenomenology. I don't think I wouldn't kind of reject phenomenology in the sense that I think it's part of her project and it's what she's doing, and she's trying to kind of rehabilitate in some way a phenomenology or a feminist phenomenology through her writing. And you know, it's funny because all the time she's claiming, look, I'm not a philosopher, you know, I just I just write poetry, you know, I can't be considered as a philosopher, but it's always creeping in the whole time into her work. You know, she's couching a lot of her discussions in phenomenological terms, and in some ways I was kind of struck by how close some of her work can be to the French thinker Catherine Malabou. And that was something I was going to kind of talk about, but I was afraid I was running over. You know, how she speaks about death as kind of not a natural event. You know, it's something that comes to us, but it's never natural. How she speaks about illness as something that is, you know, never the same for one person, or for each person. There's no universal experience of illness or pain. You know, all you can do is write about your own pain and hope that it will kind of have some political value that may be universal, but you can't say, well, look, I speak for another's pain. So I think she's very interesting in that way, and that she's kind of always toying with these ideas. I don't know if you guys want to come in on that, or?
Yeah, I'm not really a phenomenologist, but the only thing I just wanted to recommend to be read, kind of, you know, if you're interested in Boyer's work, is, I don't know if you've read Joanna Hedver, The Sick Woman essay, which I think is, you know, along with Boyer, another paradigm of how we can take this singular, completely unique experience and, you know, relate it at the same time to a kind of web of connectivity and to a wider kind of situating the phenomenology of our own experience really in a wider context. So I just wanted to recommend that essay, really. That was all. I'll try and put a link in the chat if I can find it.
If you really like Joanna Hedver, their latest publication, Minerva, A Miscarriage of the Brain, came out earlier this year. And I think I very much see these in like, very much kind of as a sort of kind of tradition that's coming out of like Abby Palmer's Sanatorium, like Sinead Gleason, of Joanna Hedver, of women, femmes, non-binary writers that are talking about illness and subjective kind of like experiences or navigations or negotiations of medical spheres that run counter to some of like the really dominant illness narratives which come out of very much like a more biomedical tradition. So if you look at some of the more kind of like the most famous illness narratives, a lot of them are either supercrypt narratives, so athletes or disabled individuals who appear to like overcome their disability to great success, which kind of frame it as like, oh, I've very much found a way to overcome whatever I perceive to be as disabling, which is very problematic in and of itself. Or they're of doctors that become ill and suddenly have to kind of negotiate the biomedical sphere from the position of a patient rather than one within a kind of socio-cultural and economic position of power. So I think Boyer's work does run against the grain of perhaps the like more mainstream illness narrative specifically. I'm not entirely sure if that's the same for autobiography. The name for kind of autobiography illness narratives gets very, again, like there's so many terms that end up being kind of commingled, especially since like the rise of what are arguably like autobiographical accounts of illness that we see coming from like the 1950s onwards. But I think I see her work as much closer to that of kind of like Alice Notley, Eileen Miles, like the early kind of like Beat Generation poets of women and femmes, again, that are writing about their lives, like about the kind of quotidian that aren't necessarily coming from structural positions of power, if that kind of makes sense.
I think that's a really nice place to stop. Read these books instead of the traditional autobiographies or the canon of illness narratives. Yeah, and Geeta, sorry, I like jumped ahead because I had it on my bookmarks. I put in the link there to Sick Woman Theory, or a kind of version of it. Brilliant, thank you, and Geeta and Kat. That was brilliant panel, brilliant thoughts there. I've written a lot of notes. Very excited now. So thank you everyone for coming. Next set of panels start at 11:15, so we've got just over 10-minute break or so. So have a look at the program online. I'm just gonna very quickly, if I can, no, I can't. Where have I put it? Okay, never mind. Have a check out the program. There are another set of 3 panels starting at 11:15. Okay, thanks everyone, and
thank you so much, Rebecca. That was amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, everybody.
So, welcome everyone to our panel on the narratives of care. And I will introduce our first speaker, Aurelie Fowler. Aurelie is going to give a presentation called Towards the Poetics of Care. She is a recent graduate from the MA student in Modern and Contemporary Writing program at the University of East Anglia. She's interested in poetry as a mode of social critique and innovative use of hybrid forms by feminized writers, as well as feminist, Marxian, and social reproduction theory. And she has also previously worked as an engagement assistant for the NHS.
There we go. Okay, I'll get started. What is care? Care comprises the various activities needed to sustain and support someone or something. The fact that this is the nature of care means that it occupies a slippery place within capitalism. Care is not productive of value. It is premised on maintaining what already exists rather than creating something new. In this way, care is fundamental to the ongoing reproduction of the capitalist system, providing the sustenance that allows people to return to work and replaces the workforce generationally. Yet Tithi Bhattacharya describes this relationship as one of reluctant dependence, because, as care is not profitable, capital is hesitant to spend any portion of its profits on it, and these vital processes are consistently unacknowledged and undermined within capitalist societies. As these contradictions mean our care systems reach crisis point, care has received much more scholarly attention. Care is conventionally theorized through disciplines such as public health, sociology, and geography. But in this paper, I'll argue for the significance of poetry as a contribution towards the growing field of care studies, contending that poetic form can uniquely illuminate the concrete way that the activity of care advances and the conditions it's performed under. The text I'll use to demonstrate this, and I know in my abstract I said I'd use a few others, but I just found there was so much to say about this one, is Verity Spott's 2017 book-length poem, Click Away, Lock Door, Stay. The notes at the back of the book describe how the poem documents the day-to-day workings of a specialist support centre that looks after young adults with high-functioning autism and related diagnoses. So what poetic form could be used to represent the daily work of care? Of her recently published book, Hopelessness, Ben Graham says, "The work defies categorization. Verity is a poet, and this book is certainly poetry, but large parts of it are in prose form. There seems to be a loose narrative, so I'm tempted to call it a short experimental novel. Ultimately, though, I just call it a book." And Click Away takes much the same form. So I'll aim to show how it experiments with these different registers to exhibit the full dimensions of care under capitalism. So returning to the notes again, Spott relates how the book structure is a narrative that assembled itself over time. And she also notes that the text has been added to, edited, and shifted almost daily, saying that it's not chronological. So depicting care requires a durational form because this work is necessarily continuous. Care must progress in tandem with, and indeed is what ensures its object's ongoing existence in the world. But Spott explicitly states that the version of narrative in her text is one that moves over time, that is assembled and added to, rather than progressing chronologically. In other words, it's durational but not linear. And I'd argue that this form actually emulates the trajectory that care takes. And in her work Enduring Time, which is a philosophy of the time of care, Lisa Baretza describes the related term of maintenance as not the time of generation or production or the eruption of the new. It is not revolutionary time, but the lateral time of on-go that tries to sustain an elongated present. And although care bolsters progression, its temporal structure is not one in which successive acts develop towards a narrative conclusion. As care is what continually keeps something going, it works up until each present moment. And this kind of perpetually present temporality of care is reflected in the poem's mode of composition, which, being added to daily, comprises an accretion of now times. Indeed, its creation itself evinces a form of care. The text does not advance along a trajectory, but instead is a mutable, growing thing, consistently sustained by editing. And the book's kind of spasmodic form is also no doubt symptomatic of the material conditions of its production, being fitted in around shifts of care work. And as we shall see in this poem about care work, care runs up against work. Within the text durational form, the temporality of care jostles against socially necessary labour time and the historical kind of downward and attritional trajectory of late capitalism. So we've discussed how the form of the text and the manner in which it was composed reflects care. But what about how it actually represents the concrete processes of care? And famously, Bernadette Meyer's 1982 long poem, Midwinter Day, was written over the course of one day and is largely in the present tense. So it kind of represents the daily reproductive and creative labour as commensurate. But the tension of work being the subject of poetry is that literary production is a different form of work, which crucially cannot be carried out while one is working. And indeed, the temporal lag inherent in poetic production is part of the structure of lyric, which is classically described as the spontaneous overflow of feelings recollected in tranquility. And in Clickaway, Spot makes hay out of this formal problem in order to represent the necessarily repetitive nature of care work when socially organised as formal employment. The text begins with this passage. And as Spot remembers a happier phase of her career, the tense shifts from past to present. The poem then employs the typical lyric technique of deixis, features that point to the time, place, or situation in which a speaker is speaking. So you can see the kind of spatial references, and later on there's she uses kind of markers like the word now. But this is interesting because what she's recounting is not a particular time, but many times. She's elaborating on what it means to work. Presenting a habit as a lyrical recollection in a book which comprises a mixture of both verse and prose emphasizes how this process forms part of the standardized, routinized patterns of work. Furthermore, this is exacerbated when we remember that the labor that Spot is describing is care work, which is necessarily repetitive. You wash off the dirt and it returns the next day. You make a meal and soon enough someone will be hungry. So at its opening, the book plays at the boundaries between poetry and prose, lyric and narrative. The phrase, to assume a false beginning, points to the fact that this work is inherently continuous and cyclical. So far we've examined how the book moves in a way which kind of replicates the way that care moves. But as we noted at the start, the work of care work exists within the system of capitalism. Spot's 2017 text was written at a time when the dismantling of the welfare state came to a head with the programme of austerity imposed following the 2008 financial crash. This policy saw the slashing of local authority care budgets, forcing councils to sell off public amenities and outsource the delivery of care to the private sector. And again, in the notes at the back of the book, Spot says, during the time of the text composition, the service was transitioning from one company to another. And at the very least, this text hopes to highlight the effect the transition had on the individuals who lived at the service and the wider contradictions of private care. So writing in this climate of austerity, Spot states at one point that the trouble with these cuts is we can't know them personally. But I'd argue that Spot's poetics actually render how these economic changes are intimately felt by revealing how capitalism's logics and contradictions shape the experience of delivering care. And now I'm going to show an example of how she experiments with the way that the text advances through time to critique the constraints that capital places on care. So we've seen that the temporality of care work is necessarily continuous, repetitive, and endless. And this means that it can't be infinitely sped up and rationalized towards the production of surplus value. As EndNotes comment, you cannot look after children more quickly. They have to be attended to 24 hours a day. However, when care becomes commodified and it is subject to attempts to maximize financial gains by decreasing socially necessary labor time. In her examination of the care crisis, which came out kind of earlier this year, Sarah Dowling describes how the companies who are increasingly contracted to deliver care services have endeavoured to make care provision more profitable by attempting to reproduce the amount of paid labour time as the basis for reducing costs and maximising productivity, increasing care worker output per unit of time. And the way that Spot achieves this critique of the conditions that she works under is through the poem's formal strategies. So, for example, Holly Pester, in her reading of the text, focuses on the technique of prosody, saying that the book is in a cadence of labour and care as oppositional planes, and how they're put into a damaging tension under capitalism for the sake of production. And she kind of describes the prosody as one of working under pressure. But last of all, I'm going to show just an example of how another technique that's used is lineation. And so kind of returning to the start of the book, we have kind of this passage. And the kind of the near repetition in the second line reflects the kind of excess of work caused by wage theft. And the kind of doubling echoes the split character of the working day that Marx described as necessary labour time, which is the time needed to produce the equivalent of the worker's livelihood, and surplus labour time, which is the time where the worker spends producing surplus value for capitalists. And then the kind of ensuing line break after this clause conveys this sense of kind of being undercut, and kind of shows how the ongoing character of care means that it's impossible to begin this work at an arbitrarily appointed time or portion it into shifts of a specified number of hours. This delusion merely constitutes another way to steal workers' labour. So I'm kind of done now. I stupidly forgot to set a time, so I don't know if I have any time left, but just to recap, I've kind of talked through the way that the text kind of replicates the way that the kind of unique way that the work of care moves and the structure of care. And then I've also kind of talked about how the way it was kind of composed can be kind of conceived as a form of care. And then finally, I've talked about the way that kind of Spot uses the text kind of formal strategies, and this is a kind of specific feature of poetry that other kind of discourses can't replicate, to talk about how the kind of constrictions from above on care work constrain it and affect the way that it's performed. So that's me. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other presentations.
Thank you so very much, Hilary. That was a fascinating presentation. And I would suggest if anyone has any longer question for Hilary or for any of the other participants, they could type them in the chat and we will read them after all the presentations are done. So now I will introduce Cynthia Laborde with her presentation, Like Mothers, Like Daughters, representing the shift from care receiver to caregiver in graphic novels about sick mothers. Cynthia is an assistant professor of French at the University of Texas at Arlington.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I hope this works. And okay, so thank you for this introduction. Thank you everyone who is attending this morning. I hope everyone's doing well. It's 5 in the morning for me because I'm in Texas right now, so bear with me. I'm not really a morning person. It said on the paper we need to describe ourselves. So I am a white French woman with curly dark blonde hair, and I'm wearing a floral shirt, and I have glasses with a clear frame. Okay. So this presentation wishes to focus on 2 autobiographical graphic novels, Tangles, A Story of Alzheimer's, My Mother and Me by Sarah Leavitt, which is a book from the USA, and Sous les bouclettes, which I can translate Under the Curls, or actually Under the Small Curls. And the graphic novel has not been translated into English, by Meleka and Gudul, and that's a graphic novel from France. Both of these graphic novels revolve around the role of the daughters in caring for their sick mothers during the last years of their mothers' lives. In Tangles, the cartoonist mother, Midge, she has Alzheimer, as indicated in the title, and in Sous les bouclettes, Under the Curls, Gudul, the mother, has a glioma, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, which is a cancerous brain tumor. So my goal in this short presentation is to show that the comic book format is particularly suited to humanize the ills and build empathy from the reader. The first thing I want to do is to draw your attention to the book covers of each of these graphic novels. On the left, Tangles, on the right, Under My Curls. The cover of Tangles has 4 distinct images. Mother and daughter holding hands in the top left corner, although the hands themselves are not drawn, as if the daughter was just a continuity of her mother via one long arm. The mother looking at herself in the mirror on the top right corner, a strip representing a forest with different trees in the middle, and the bottom image is a silhouette of the daughter drawing on a notebook while sitting on a bed. Under My Curls is a single image taking up the entire page. Disproportionately we can see the big profile of Gudule, which is the mom. Half of the page is representing her luscious curly hair, within which one can see different people and things that were part of her life, and her daughter on the top of her head as if she was leading. On both covers, the special bond between mothers and daughters is represented without being completely central. Also on both covers, the idea of books and writing and documenting is present, as it is possible to see a typewriter floating pages and some books in Gudule's hair, for instance. Even more symbolically, it's the notion of things being meshed at different levels that is represented on both covers. With the images, we have Gudule's hair on one hand, and with the like of hands joining Midge and her daughter on the other. But also in their title themselves, with the word tangles and curls, both artists underline the complexity of defining what a life is, thus representing it. And we often simplify and represent life as a straight line from one point to the other, from one beginning to an end. But we know it's actually much more complex than that. Not only do we talk about the ups and downs of life, but think, for instance, about the most famous passage in all of In Search of Lost Time by Proust, when he's instantly taken aback into his childhood by simply dipping a Madeleine into a cup of tea, something he used to do as a kid and forgot about. Our past, and this holds even more true for traumatic events, as psychological studies have shown, constantly bleeds into our present. Moreover, we have a life anchored in reality and an inner life. Both are intertwined and equally important. Finally, our lives are intricated with others. With others' lives. I quote, "All identity is relational because the self is defined by and lives in terms of its relation with others," end of quote, as explains Dr. Paul Jean Ikin. In fact, these two books are partially autobiographies, the stories of these authors, and partially biographies, the stories of their mom. In the case of life writing, works that deal specifically with, I don't know what I did there. Oh yeah. So when we talk about life writing, the works that deal specifically with, and I quote, living with, loving or knowing intimately someone with an odd or anomalous body are called somatographies. And it's Thomas Kuser who has coined that term. And according to Amelia Del Falco in her essay, Graphic Somatographies, Life Writing, Comics, and the Ethics of Care, I quote, "Graphic somatographies are a type of comic that depicts experiences of vulnerable caused by illness or impairment, repeatedly drawing attention to the fragility of embodiment and the inevitable of interdependence care," end of quote. She, as well as many others, such as Hilary Shute, Ian Williams, Elizabeth Arafe, which I'm going to quote a little later, think that comics as a medium have a unique ability to, thanks to the use of text and images, represent realistically and or symbolically the human experience, including the different facets of our lives, and particularly human embodiment. The idea of humanizing is an important one when talking about empathy. The sick, and here I am thinking notably about Foucault and the medical gaze, and the elderly are often infantilized, if not dehumanized altogether. Despite portraying their mothers during the most dehumanizing moment of their lives, when they have, for instance, lost all control of their own bodies and lost most of their mind, both artists actually are able to humanize their mothers. The definition of humanizing is, and that's from the Webster Dictionary, to address or portray someone in a way that emphasizes that person's humanity or individuality. End of citation. Both artists included many memories of their mothers when they were the mothers, meaning kind of like the role model, the caregiver, the protectors, whatever mothers meant to them. While they narrate the last difficult years, they often contrast the moments of extreme vulnerability with memories of strength, showing that their mothers are more than they were now, and showing what they used to be and could still be if only they were not ill. This superimposition of various timelines allows for the daughter to become their mother's voice when themselves have become voiceless. As a matter of fact, for Under the Curls, Meleka listed her mother as a co-author because Meleka illustrated her mother's memories that the mothers recounted herself. While not completely in color, Under the Curls, Meleka uses shades of blue for the present tense, not exactly the present because it's still a story, but and shades of brown to represent the past and the memories of her mother. So most of the time when her mother was young, before having kids, or when the kids were really young. The narration goes back and forth between the two. The distinction is a little more subtle in Tangles, as Sarah Leavitt used some of her mother's notes, drawings, and doodles within her own drawings, and she incorporates those. The multiplicity of representation of both the daughters and the mothers isn't, as one could think, a failure to grasp a person's identity. On the contrary, as Charles Hatfield argues, it participates in showing the entirety and their complexity. I quote, paradoxically, playing with one's image can be a way of asserting the irreducibility of the self as agent, end of quote. This applies to one's image or to the image of someone close to you, especially when that image is changing drastically and perhaps not in a good way. Both daughters talk a lot and draw often the changing bodies of their mothers, which is losing its agency. Beyond the drawings of their mothers, for the need of a book, there is a special bond between the bodies of children and their biological parents. The physical one, of course, the space they came from and the body that nourished them as an infant, but also a psychological one. During what Lacan calls the mirror stage, Lacan claims that when a child is around 6 months old, they are able for the first time to recognize themselves in the mirror. However, that image is deeply unsatisfactory, as the child also recognizes that their body isn't autonomous and that they can't, for instance, stand on their own. He needs others in others to move, and others is often the caregivers, and often meaning the parents. These parents and their autonomous bodies become the model to which this child aspires. So our caregivers' bodies are the first one the child identifies with and relates to. And it is therefore very difficult to witness these bodies losing their autonomy and the reversal from the role of care receiver to caregiver. Now, there are different ways these bodies and what they are going through are embodied in these works. Not only there are different types of both verbal and visual metaphors to draw in the reader, and once more call for empathy, but also because metaphors of what we experience through our bodies are not static. So Elizabeth Elrafe coined the term dynamic embodiment. She argues, and I quote, that the human experience of our own bodies is forever adjusting to changes in our social cultural beliefs and practices, or individual bodily disposition and dysfunctions, and the activities we are engaged in, end of quote. She explains that illnesses disturb the way we experience our bodies and thus changes. It changes our thought patterns of our all corporal experience. In addition, the medium we use to communicate has an impact on the metaphor we use to talk about our corporal experience. And finally, she demonstrates that there are 3 different types of visual metaphors related to our bodies: pictorial, and I put the page here as a reference because then she says within those 3 there are different types also. So pictorial metaphors and the sense emerging from and I'm quoting from her, emerging from specific ways of depicting one or more concrete identities, spatial, emerging from correlations between the experience of our bodies in space and more abstract concept, and stylistic, emerging from the style of the pictures, words, abstract visual elements. So I have one example from each work. Let's see. The first one is from Tangle, and I believe it's a stylistic metaphor, maybe isomorphic. Ironically, it symbolizes the usual dehumanization of the EL person and what the author is fighting against. So she's literally giving a face, and a face to her mother and a face to the illness. And that metaphor is a faceless white shape against a black background. And under the curls, I believe it's a spatial metaphor that's compositional. So we can see her mother's face free-drawn on the page with a smaller version of herself behind prison bars on her forehead to symbolize how the illness is trapping her inside her own body, inside her own mind. Just like parents often meticulously document their children's lives at the beginning of their lives, pictures, baby books, collecting drawings and craft, these women compiled both tough and touching moments of the last years of their mother's life, reversing the role from care receiver to caregiver. But they did much more than that. Our identities are the stories we said about ourselves and others said about us. And I quote, "Until the day we die, we're living the story of our lives. And like a novel in process, our life stories is always changing, evolving, being edited, rewritten, and embellished by an unreliable narrator. We are in large part our personal stories," end of quote. And that's from Jonathan Gottschall. So if we are the stories of our life and we cannot tell our story anymore, what is the role of others in preserving that story and therefore a part of ourselves, both alive realistically and symbolically? By giving them a choice, a voice, by continuing their stories, both daughters allowed their mother to keep their dignity and humanity and told us a story most of us can relate to, calling for more empathy for elders at the end of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. It was a fascinating presentation in Son, and how you brought together the textual and the visual. I look forward to the discussions at the end. And I'm going to now introduce our next presenter, Erin Soros, with the paper Holding Birdie, Trace Lindbergh's Visions of Care. Tracy Lindbergh has stated, what I would like to present about Erin is that she is a satire scholar and writer of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, and she is a postdoctoral fellow at the Society for Humanities at Cornell University, where she researches psychotic responses to trauma. And next year, she will be a Shadbolt Fellow at Simon Fraser University, where she will complete her collection of autobiographical essays on psychosis and psychiatric treatment. And her research has been published in the Canadian Journal of Women and the Law and Differences, a journal of feminist cultural studies. And an essay on Indigenous literature appeared in the Anthology Literature of Madness. Essays weaving narrative, philosophy, and psychoanalysis have appeared in Writing Creative Nonfiction and Women and Social Construction of Madness and many other interesting publications. She was a Charles Pick Fellow and the University of East Anglia, and the Harper Wood Fellow at Cambridge University, and her stories were also published internationally and were aired on the CBC and BBC as recipients of the CBC Literary Award and the Commonwealth Award for the short story. Now I also have a content warning. Erin's presentation deals with Indigenous genocide. It will be a written form presentation, but there are some sensitive topics that you might take into account. I'm sure we will all learn quite a lot from it. So Erin, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, and it's written lyrically and not graphically, but I just wanted to warn people. And I'm in Cayuga land now, and I'm in the middle of moving back to Tsleil-Waututh territory in BC, and today's my moving day. And as a image of a precarity, I'm reading on a sad lamp propped on my turquoise colander because I have no furniture left because I'm sold it all. Anyway, I am a white cis woman, blue top, brown hair, blue eyes, waving at you. Thank you. I'll start. I'm speaking about a novel Birdie by Tracy Lindbergh, a Cree author who lives in the territory that we now call Canada. In the acknowledgement pages for Birdie, Tracy Lindbergh says the novel is intended to free, not capture, a life. We speak of an artist capturing a likeness. A critic might aim to capture the essence of a work. Lindbergh's words give us pause about these dynamics and their interplay with forms of capture that are both colonial and violent. In a public lecture aired on the CBC, Tracy Lindbergh invoked the Black cars that came to take Indigenous children to residential schools, and the Black cars that came to take Indigenous adults to prison, and the Black cars that came to relocate Indigenous family members within foster care in settler homes. None of these carceral structures or colonial rule are referenced specifically in the novel. The deadly capture of women in Vancouver's downtown East Side is spoken only elliptically, a warning given to a character as she arrives at the cusp of the neighborhood. You know, you shouldn't go there at this time. You might go, says the stranger as his words trail away at what he does not want to name. Missing, says Maggie, because she does know, and the word is set on its own, past and present and future, figure for loss and the emotion left in its wake. These various structures of colonial capture and ongoing threat form the backdrop of the characters in the novel, yet they do not need to be declared. If you do not know this psychic environment, if you are not from the community of the characters affected by them, you cannot expect this novel to teach you. Yet it does teach you. What the narrative dramatizes is the residual sexual violence that echoes in intimate corners. Canada's reconciliation narrative asserts that the time of residential schools is over, that this colonial atrocity had a beginning and an end. But the novel reveals that the institutions do not have to exist as buildings for the violations introduced within them to continue. The main character, Bernice, nicknamed affectionately by her family as Birdie, is a Cree young woman who was abused as a girl by two uncles. Their invasive groping and sexual demands a form of capture. The story reveals how she launches an escape to the travels of her mind. She loves books, but her stories are also internal and less tidy than the narratives she finds in the library. Hers is a vast mental roaming that can be productively disorienting for readers to follow, yet easy for settler medical systems to diagnose and attempt to fix in place. At one point in the novel, the character is tied. She does not know exactly where she is. She can identify that she is inside a room, not her home. This three-word sentence lacks a verb and begins with a certainty of negation. It has a clipped and jerky feel that mimics the jarring moment of finding oneself elsewhere. Her consciousness is trying to locate where it is. The sentences are set off on the page, formatted like a poem, the repulsion of prose halted, the mark of absence taking silent form, white spaces between sentences and white space all around sentences, around the one-syllable words, the child words. The words become a body separated from anything that could be familiar. She woke up in a room and could not move. She woke up in a room and was tied to herself. She woke up in a room and was herself tied. She woke up in a room and found she was not changed. She woke up in a room and learned she was crazy. The sentence "she woke up" is echoed 6 times. She could be waking up on several occasions to have found herself remaining in the same place. Or the repetition could be one of emphasis, the need to declare to herself over and over again what is happening, what can't be happening. 1 moment or 6 moments together, an instant of time breaking apart, or multiple instances collapsing into one. The wake here is not release, but enclosure. Consciousness itself a kind of entrapment. The phrase "in a room" is also repeated 5 times. The broken simplicity gathering a menacing quality. This is not a childhood place of respite from abuse, and not the room above a bakery where Bernice will be free to dream and to walk out the door. We have so few descriptors for time and place on this page, for where and when she is, no words for cause and effect, the narrative stilling terribly in a room. And within this container, she has been tied to herself. The phrasing is repeated and reversed, a chiasmic rendering of sameness. Or is it different? To be herself tied. The words have been knotted. And at the end of this series of clipped assertions, we have the sentence, "He was crazy." And it is set on its own diagnostic declaration, ontological assertion of her unchanged and unchanging essence that lacks the clinical vocabulary and offers her only this word, crazy, that is so often voiced with contempt. This final sentence is separate from, yet prefaced by an incomplete sentence above it that describes her interiorization of this apparent truth. Learning as fixing. Her mind comprehends the diagnosis as her body is pinned, static as a butterfly on a board. Tracy Lindbergh has described Birdie as a teaching of Cree law. She has written legal documents that are more conventionally pedagogical, but risked writing a narrative because of the way the form travels into the privacy of our homes and the corridors of our hearts. In her public speaking, the words Lindbergh uses in relation to Cree teachings are respect and reciprocity. And her novel Birdie reveals how these words can be manifest in action, how we can treat each other with such qualities even or especially when someone is going through a psychological experience one does not comprehend. In fact, comprehension seems not to be the main priority in the relations between characters. Understanding, too, can be a form of capture. Bernice is not diagnosed or defined by people who make them to care for her. Instead, we witness reciprocal accompaniment without the necessity to know. When Bernice escapes her family home and then escapes the institution she calls the SAN, she journeys to Gibson's Landing in British Columbia in search of a romantic ideal, Pat Johnson, the Indigenous man who played Jesse Jim in the television series The Beachcombers. Instead of finding him, she gets a job in a bakery, Lola's little slice of heaven, and sleeps in a room above its noises and resonant smells. In this place, she is in and out of her mind. She flies, returning both mentally and physically to the abuse, the experience of the SAN, her treatment by a white foster family, and scenes of the women in her family, their stubborn grit and glamour, the ways they witnessed each other. These visions float, a fluid and open and reaching time, a different time than the startling stasis of being tied to oneself. In these pages, she is other, and her mind breaks the boundary of the room. The stories bringing Bernice to and through suffering are themselves a form of freedom. She is upstairs, and from downstairs she hears the rustling and chatter of the bakery owner who hired her, Lola, an older white woman, tough but kind, someone who is not above a racist joke, but who also welcomes Bernice and feeds Bernice and lets her rest and lets her come and go. For the most part, Lola stays in the kitchen. She is with Bernice, but separate. She brings treats, offers care, and provides a soundtrack of laughter. When Bernice leaves for a vulnerable evening and then returns, Lola responds to her in Cree. How does she do this? What cusp has been crossed? Lola keeps to her domestic domain and does not travel with Bernice, but still something has changed in her. And it didn't come through consciously studying the language, but through some other mysterious gestalt. Tracy Lindbergh shared in the CBC lectures that her editor suggested she combine the settler character of Lola with the Cree character of Bernice's cousin, Frida. These women had similar personalities, feisty, ornery. Lindbergh has compared their toughness to pemmican. The editors felt the characters both played the same function and that readers would have trouble telling them apart. But when Bernice's cousin Frida finally arrives at Gibson's, skinny Frida, she takes a place inside the room when Bernice travels. Frida relates to Bernice in a way that Lola does not. She has shared Bernice's childhood and has long witnessed her fight. When she arrives in Gibson's Landing, there's a softening of the story and a healing of Bernice, a slowing of the narrative, and a gathering of fragments. Lola's response to Bernice is one of doing, not possessing or fixing or even knowing. In a key scene, she goes with Bernice to enact a ceremony at a sacred tree, the tree of life, feeding it too, standing parallel with Bernice and her cousin and aunt in order to respect this other living thing that Lola comes to sense is her relation, just as Bernice is her relation. Lola doesn't quite comprehend her actions, but the ceremony has its own promise and its own power. Quote, it was waiting to be fed, to have nations unite in one place, unquote. If Birdie is a teaching of law, what then is our responsibility, my responsibility, as a reader and a teacher in relation to the words? What is our ongoing relationship to the text? Does it create something beyond its pages? Does it speak something into being? And what is a reader's role in this speech? How do Cree laws shared in a novel travel across Indigenous territories that have their own laws and protocols? What would the Cree law ask of settler readers that might be different or similar to what they ask of those readers who are Indigenous? How do these laws apply to the very institutions where the book is taught? The tenet of Cree law known as Wakotowin, that all human beings treat each other like relatives, that we have a reciprocal obligation to take care of one another as if we were universally bound by family ties. If fiction reforms law, law also reforms fiction. To conceive of a novel as a teaching of laws makes the narrative other than aesthetic object to be understood. The novel positions its readers within an orientation to action, to relation, to the future. We read the pages and we are read by them. They apply to us.
Thank you very much, Erin. This was an extraordinary presentation. I think that we all can take something from it regardless of our field of study. Unfortunately, I have not heard from Sarah yet, so I'm going to skip to the questions section. So let's first check the comments. I don't see any comment in the chat yet. So I would like to pose my first question to Cynthia. regarding the way in which women artists use visual mechanisms to represent such challenges in their personal lives and in the lives of their mothers. So my question, Cynthia, would be, do you know more about the way in which these comics that you presented were created? Were they created during their mother illness? Were they created after their mothers had passed away? Have the artists spoken about how difficult it was to portray such experiences, like the changing of the bodily changes and all the medical maneuvers and everything else you mentioned?
From what I remember reading about how they made the stories, it was put together after, although it was they started thinking about it and drawing parts of it during. But I think especially for Tangles, I remember, if I remember correctly, she took a couple of years before putting the book together. For Under the Curls, I don't remember. I do think it was a project that was completed after as well, because it's very emotional, right? And I read Tangles with my students this semester because we did a course entirely in English, entirely on graphic narrative of around the medical world, and it's definitely the one book that touched them the most, because it's hard. We can, most of us, I don't want to say everybody, but most of us can relate to those stories, and we're gonna have probably to face something like that at some point. And they were the first one to do it. It was only 15 minutes, so I had to but I think one of the first one to portray the last year of your life of her parents, although she helped as a caregiver, but she wasn't the primary caregiver. They had people, is Joyce Farmer's with the book Special Exit. That's also a wonderful, wonderful book. But that was much earlier. I think that was in the 70s that she did that. Also a very emotional book. But I do think the project, it needs a little bit of, again, from what I remember, a little bit of time after their parents has passed, and then they're able to do the project. Actually, there is one book that's father and child. We read it, and I don't remember the title, but I think it was the same. And they always, not always, but they often proceed in the same way, where they cannot bring themselves to only show their parents in their most vulnerable state. And they always have to bring back, well, this is what they were when I was a child, and when they were kind of the adult and the care provider. Like they used to be like that. And I don't want to reduce them to what they are at the end of their lives. And I don't want other people to reduce them to that either.
Thank you very much. Yes, being in visual studies, I was particularly drawn to your presentation, and it reminded me of a collaboration between a Polish and a British photographer and his Polish mother-in-law, who had been a physician all her life in Warsaw. And she was diagnosed with an incurable condition and agreed to being photographed and painted on by the son-in-law. But this relationship changed during the final period of her illness, and it actually posed grave ethical concerns for the hospital, because even if she had initially agreed to being portrayed by the son-in-law in a clinical space, afterwards he seemed more reticent. And I'm thinking how those mothers would have reacted if they would have been portrayed during their lives, if they would have seen their daughters making sketches while they would still be making sense of that activity.
Oh, I think they Under the Curls, I think they knew, because they were both artists, and I think Melika had done other books, and I think she knew that. For Tangles, I think she, at one point in the book, if I remember correctly, I think she is trying to tell her mother, look, I draw you, but her mother she doesn't comprehend anymore what's going on, so she can't appreciate, or she doesn't really have a feedback on that. I think it depends on people, really. I remember also in David B. Epileptic, in one of these interviews, someone asked, what does your brother thinks about the way you portray him? And he says, my brother doesn't he thinks it's for drawings are for kids. He doesn't really care, doesn't really understand. So I don't know, there might be a question of consent there, that we might want to ask. Actually, should they be doing that? Are they allowed to do that? I don't know.
Thank you very much. No, it's a very good answer. Rory, again, it's just a fascinating presentation. My question would be regarding basically all the mechanisms you exposed regarding care and how it can be represented. Do you think that could be maybe introduced in the medical education, maybe for medical students to analyze poems, to try and think more of the structures?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and I think what I was kind of trying to do with the presentation is kind of show. I think people often have this idea of poetry as kind of this kind of, and especially experimental poetry, of which this book is kind of very experimental, of a kind of being kind of inaccessible and kind of rarefied and something that's kind of quite intimidating to approach. But I think what I was kind of trying to show is how instructive it can be, and also how that kind of attitude, it can be quite kind of elitist, saying that that kind of people can't grapple with kind of complex ideas, and that and actually complex ideas sometimes need to be kind of phrased in different ways, and that's kind of where poetic techniques can come through. So I think kind of what I was trying to show is that actually these specific kind of concrete and felt and kind of lived experiences kind of can't be kind of rendered through a kind of simple narrative form, and that actually a kind of poetic form is much more kind of useful.
Thank you very much. So does anyone have any other questions for our presenters? So in that case, I will also ask a question for Erin. Being from Eastern Europe, I have, of course, followed the news with what is happening in Canada, but I have a very base knowledge, and I feel like I have found out a lot of more things I want to read about and research about. So my question would be, how do you think such works should be contextualized to be presented to audiences outside Canada, for people who are not so familiar with that sort of colonialism and those sort of relationships, like outside the British and Canadian sphere?
Yeah, my mind immediately went to the British sphere, actually, because I did my PhD in England, and England didn't have the sense of the context, and England caused the context. Wow. So my students, I taught a development studies course in a human rights, it was human rights and literature in development studies.
Yes.
So it wasn't in my department. I was teaching my department, but I also taught in development studies. So that's a self-selecting group of students. These are
I understand.
They did not. I had a student who didn't know that there were Aboriginal people in Australia. I had students who didn't. I would have to stop because I was teaching literature, and I had to stop and go the Balfour Agreement, this agreement, this. I had to start teaching law and history because people had no comprehension, because the erasure, the settler erasure, it had been so complete in the UK. They didn't see Canadian or Australia history as genocidal. They didn't see any relationship to the UK. They had no, it was, and these are students who were studying development and human rights.
Yes.
I mean, so I felt that I was already working with ignorance. And so when you're working with communities who have, for example, other communities where there are other histories, and I don't know, for example, the intimate history of other colonized areas, or I don't know the intimate history of other countries in the way that you would on the ground. And I think that's a really good question. And I hesitated with this paper because I felt that I was such a short time. I didn't know how to contextualize. Like, I'm referencing things, bang, missing and murdered women. That's like that's a dissertation. Like there's all these things and it becomes. I'm really worried about it because it becomes reductive, and it becomes a kind of, it can be that you reduce, you're taking it out of that context and making an aesthetic object. So what I tried to do is braid some of that, because I can't do all of it, but write some of it. But what I'm also always trying to do in my work is kind of turn back on the problem that I'm working with. So turning back on a longer, when I do a longer version of this piece, I situate what does it mean to be teaching this work in a Canadian institution that is built on Indigenous land? And we keep saying it's an Indigenous land, but we're never doing anything about returning the land. Like what is that? Are we teaching that novel if we're teaching it and not according to any of its laws? What are we doing in that situation? So what am I doing? If I had a longer version and I was giving this in a context where I could really outline things, I could do that, but I'm also, even then it would still be incomplete. So I'm always kind of attending to the fragmentary, attending to the incompletion, raising questions, working with hesitations, complicity, questioning my own knowledge. And even there, the images in the story, there's the Indigenous woman, Frida, and Bernice. And what that story introduces is that I could give you all sorts of facts. I could tell you all the facts. You could do a PhD in history. You still won't get Indigenous genocide. It's a bodily knowledge. It's, so there's something that her cousin knows, that Lola, this woman who is caring for her, just doesn't access. And she has these glimmerings. She has these moments where she starts speaking Cree, and it's not explained why. But I think there are these intimate moments. And I think when you talk about the care work of the other pieces, that we do a leap. If you're caring for somebody intensely, there are these moments of leap and subjectivity.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. So if anyone has any other questions, you can raise your hand or you can type them in the chat. Otherwise, I think that we have had 3 very different presentations, but which also have so much in common, because we have the women's perspective, we have this accent on domesticity and of spaces and activities which were ignored for so many times, which are usually performed by women. And we have this opening up of these spaces right now to the world, but which is not performative, which is in itself an act of embodiment of the women's wishes and of the women's experiences. And hopefully it will lead to many more works in all these regiments, in all these autobiographic, in all these visual, in all these textual productions, which so well embodies the experience of marginalized women and of women maybe faced with, like Cynthia said, something we all have to go through by our status of being women. We usually are carers in families. It doesn't matter if we're in Canada or in Eastern Europe or in the UK or in other parts of the world. It is just something which is sort of imposed of us, but still we do it. And it is very important to get these experiences out there and to form a form of network of support and to learn from each other's experience.
I just wanted to just comment. Yeah. I said my mind was going back to when I was teaching in the UK, which was years ago, and the text we were working with, written by Indigenous authors, were using Aboriginal, but I've also heard critiques of that word. So I realized I'm sort of shifting. That's again something that I would speak about, is when you're doing cross-cultural work, that it's care work itself, and it involves mistakes and accountability and reckoning, and like it's not like, so I think that what's interesting about these pieces and the tenderness with which you facilitated and we were bringing together, that the stories change how we are, I think, in the classroom, and change how we are together as groups of readers.
Well, thank you very much, Erin, for that contribution. And I'm sure that if you have any further questions, you can contact the presenters through email or on their Twitter addresses. It was a wonderful session. Thank you all for attending. And a special thanks to our presenters, Elena, Cynthia, and Eileen, and of course to our producer, Adina. We shall close our session now, and hopefully we will meet in the following one. Thank you all. Have a nice day.